Tonight, we will explore the nature of judgment, how we see ourselves and how others see us, and discover the profound difference between what we are and what we think we are. We will journey through stories of a dyer whose hands tell the truth of his craft, a farmer whose small dishonesty creates great consequences, and others who learned that our suffering often comes not from our circumstances, but from the stories we tell ourselves about those circumstances. There is nothing you need to do tonight, nothing to fix, no one you need to become. You can simply rest here, allowing these ancient teachings to wash over you like gentle rain on still water. If this path of wisdom calls to you, I invite you to subscribe to join us on future journeys into the heart of Buddhist understanding. Let your breath soften now. Feel the weight of your body supported by whatever holds you. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to accomplish. This moment is complete as it is. Let us begin this journey together. In a village where the river ran deep and slow, where morning mist clung to the water until the sun burned it away, there lived a man named Jivan who worked with indigo. His workshop stood near the riverbank, and from dawn until dusk, the sound of cloth being dipped and lifted, created a rhythm that the whole village knew. Children would stop on their way to school to peer through his doorway, watching the white cotton disappear into dark blue water and emerge transformed, dripping with the color of deep evening sky. Jivan had learned his craft from his father, who had learned it from his father before him. 3 generations of hands had stirred the same wooden vats, had lifted the same kind of cloth, had created the same miraculous transformation from plain to beautiful. The indigo trade was old in this place, older than anyone could remember, and the dye itself came from plants that grew wild along the riverbank, small leaves that held within them this impossible depth of blue. But working with indigo leaves its mark on those who practice the craft. The dye seeps into everything it touches, the wooden tools, the clay pots, the stone floor of the workshop, and most of all, it seeps into the hands of the dyer. No matter how carefully Jivan worked, no matter how often he washed, the blue found its way into the creases of his palms, under his fingernails, into the very pores of his skin. After 20 years of this work, his hands were permanently stained the color of midnight water. At first, when he was young, Jivan had been proud of these marks. They were the badge of his profession, proof of his skill and dedication. Other craftsmen had calluses or scars. He had these beautiful blue hands that marked him as a master of his art. But as the years passed, something began to change in how others saw him. It started with small things. When he went to the market to buy vegetables, the vendor would pause before taking coins from his blue-stained fingers, as if the color might rub off on the money. Children, who had once watched his work with wonder, began to point and whisper when he walked past. "Look at the blue man," they would say, giggling nervously. "His hands are cursed." The whispers grew louder over time. Some said his hands were dirty, that he never washed properly. Others claimed the blue was a sign of some spiritual contamination, that he had been marked by dark forces. A few even suggested that eating food prepared by someone with such hands might bring bad luck or illness. None of this was true, of course. Indigo was a natural dye, harmless as the leaves it came from. But truth has little power against fear and superstition. Jivan tried to ignore the comments at first. He knew his work was good, knew his hands were clean despite their color. The cloth he created was sought after in markets 3 towns away. Rich merchants commissioned special pieces from him. His indigo held its color longer and truer than anyone else's. Surely this should matter more than gossip and foolish fears. But human beings are not made of stone. Drop by drop, the judgment of others began to seep into his heart, just as the indigo had seeped into his hands. He found himself washing his hands longer and harder, scrubbing with rough stones until they were raw, hoping somehow to remove the stain that had become part of him. When that failed, he began wearing gloves whenever he left his workshop. Thick leather gloves that hid the blue entirely, but made simple tasks clumsy and difficult. The gloves helped with strangers, but they could not solve the deeper problem that was growing inside him. Every morning when he woke, the first thing Jivan saw were his own hands. Blue hands, stained hands. Hands that marked him as different, as someone to be whispered about and avoided. He began to see his hands not as the tools of his beautiful craft, but as evidence of something shameful about himself. This shame grew like a shadow at midday, short at first, but lengthening as time passed. He stopped taking pride in his work. When customers came to commission pieces, he kept his hands hidden behind the counter or in his pockets. He began to speak less, smile less, meet fewer eyes. The joy that had once filled his workshop, the satisfaction of watching white cloth become blue, the pleasure of creating beauty that would last for years, began to fade like old dye left too long in sunlight. His work began to suffer. Distracted by his self-consciousness, he made small mistakes. Cloth left too long in the vat until it became muddy, pieces not stirred properly so the color was uneven. These errors were minor, barely noticeable to most eyes. But Jivan saw them as proof that he was losing his skill along with his dignity. Perhaps the villagers were right to whisper. Perhaps there was something wrong with him. The worst moments came at festivals and celebrations, when the whole village gathered in the square and he had to decide whether to join or stay hidden in his workshop. If he went, people would notice his hands despite his efforts to conceal them. Someone would point, someone would whisper, someone would make sure their children stayed away from the blue man. If he stayed home, he felt the weight of his isolation like a stone in his chest. One particular evening, during the harvest festival, when the entire village was celebrating the season's abundance, Jivan sat alone in his workshop. Through his window, he could see the colored lanterns strung between the houses, could hear the music and laughter echoing off the stone buildings. Every family in the village was there, sharing food and stories, celebrating together. Everyone except him. He looked down at his hands in the lamplight. The blue seemed darker than ever, more obvious, more shameful. These hands that had created so much beauty, that had learned their skill over decades of patient practice, that carried forward the knowledge of his fathers. All he could see in them now was the reason for his exile from normal life. Let us pause here for a moment. Feel your own hands resting wherever they are. Notice how they feel. Their weight, their warmth, their simple presence. These hands of yours have done so much, created so much, touched so much of your world. There is nothing they need to be except exactly what they are. Take a gentle breath. Let it soften as it leaves you. You are held here, supported, exactly as you are. As Jivan sat in his solitude, lost in the familiar spiral of shame and self-judgment, he heard footsteps on the path outside his workshop. This was unusual. During festivals, everyone stayed in the square until very late. Who would be walking alone through the quiet streets? The footsteps paused outside his door, and then came a gentle knock. Jivan's first instinct was to pretend he wasn't there, to wait silently until whoever it was went away. But something in the quality of the knock, patient, unhurried, somehow kind, made him reconsider. "Good evening," called a voice from outside. "I saw your lamp burning and wondered if you might spare a few moments to speak with a traveler." Jivan hesitated. His hands were uncovered, stained blue in the lamplight. But there was something in the voice that suggested this visitor might be different from the villagers who had learned to fear his appearance. Slowly, he rose and opened the door. Standing outside was an elderly monk, his robes worn soft from many years of wear, his face lined but peaceful. A walking staff rested in his right hand, and a simple traveling bag hung from his shoulder. His eyes were clear and direct, neither curious about Jivan's appearance nor carefully looking away from it. "I am Dharma Bhante," the monk said simply. "I have been walking all day and hoped I might rest here for a few minutes before continuing on my way. I saw that you work with indigo, such a beautiful craft. May I come in?" Jivan stepped back, gesturing for the monk to enter. His hands remained at his sides, neither hidden nor displayed. Somehow the monk's presence made such calculations seem less important. Dharma Bhante looked around the workshop with genuine interest, taking in the wooden vats, the drying racks hung with cloth in various shades of blue, the tools arranged with the care of a master craftsman. "Extraordinary," the monk said, running his fingers along a piece of deep blue silk that hung near the door. "The color is so rich, so alive. It seems to hold light rather than simply reflect it. You must have great skill to create such depth." "Thank you," Jivan said quietly. It had been months since anyone had commented on his work with such appreciation. "Would you like some tea?" "That would be very kind." As Jivan prepared tea on the small brazier in the corner of his workshop, he found himself glancing at the monk, trying to understand this visitor who seemed so comfortable in his presence. Most people, even those who didn't actively fear him, maintained a certain distance. They were polite but careful, friendly but cautious. This old man seemed to see only another human being offering hospitality. "The festival sounds lively," Dharma Bhante observed, settling onto a low stool and accepting the cup Jivan offered him. "Yes," Jivan replied, taking his own cup but not yet sitting down. "The whole village celebrates the harvest together every year. But you are not there." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't spoken with judgment or pity, simply an observation, offered the way one might note that the evening was growing cool or that rain was beginning to fall. Jivan looked down at his hands wrapped around the warm teacup. The blue stains were clearly visible against the white ceramic. I don't really fit in at such gatherings anymore." "Ah," said the monk, sipping his tea thoughtfully. "And why is that?" This simple question opened something in Jivan that had been closed for so long he had forgotten it was there. Perhaps it was the genuine curiosity in the monk's voice, or the way he asked without any trace of gossip or judgment. Perhaps it was simply that Jivan had been alone with his shame for so many months that meeting someone who seemed to see him clearly was like water in a desert. "Look at my hands," Jivan said, holding them out so the monk could see them properly in the lamplight. 20 years of working with indigo has stained them blue, permanently. They'll never be normal again. Dharma Bhante studied Jivan's hands with the same careful attention he had given the silk cloth. His gaze was neither sympathetic nor dismissive, simply interested, as if he were examining something he had never seen before. "They are quite beautiful," the monk said finally. "The color is so even, so deep, like looking at the evening sky reflected in still water." Jivan blinked in surprise. Beautiful. No one had called his hands beautiful in years. "But they're stained," he said. "Marked. Everyone in the village whispers about them. Children point and laugh. People avoid touching anything I've handled." "I see," said the monk. "And what do you see when you look at your hands?" "I see." Jivan paused, realizing he had never really asked himself this question. He had become so focused on how others saw his hands that he had stopped looking at them through his own eyes. I see stained hands, dirty hands, hands that mark me as different, as someone to be avoided. Dharmapante nodded thoughtfully. That is one way to see them. But tell me, what created these stains? The indigo, of course, years and years of working with the dye. And what does this work create? Jivan gestured around his workshop at the cloth hanging in various stages of completion. Beauty, I suppose. Color. Things that bring joy to people. So these hands, the monk said, still looking at Jivan's blue-stained fingers. These hands create beauty. They transform plain cloth into something that brings joy. They carry forward a craft that has been practiced for generations. They have learned skills that few people possess. Is this correct? Well, yes. Then I ask you again, what do you see when you look at your hands? For the first time in months, Jivan really looked at his own hands. Not through the lens of village gossip, not through the filter of his accumulated shame, but simply as they were. He saw strong fingers that could judge the precise moment to lift cloth from the dye. He saw palms that had learned to feel the difference between properly mixed indigo and dye that was too weak or too strong. He saw hands that had created thousands of beautiful pieces, that had brought color and joy into the world, that carried within their very stains the evidence of a life spent in meaningful work. I'm beginning to see hands that have done beautiful work, Jivan said slowly. The monk smiled. Yes, and now I have another question for you. Do you see blue hands, or do you see hands that bring color to the world? The question hung in the air between them like incense smoke, simple but penetrating. Jivan felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of something that had been tight for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. Hands that bring color to the world, he whispered. This story shows us how we suffer not from what we are, but from how we judge what we are. Jivan discovered that his hands had never changed, only his way of seeing them had changed. Buddhism teaches that our suffering often comes not from our circumstances, but from the stories we tell ourselves about our circumstances. When we see clearly, without the distortion of shame or fear, we often find that what we thought was our burden is actually our gift. The indigo that stained Jivan's hands was not a mark of shame, but a mark of mastery, not evidence of contamination, but proof of creation. Let us explore another story, one that shows us how small dishonesty creates large consequences, spreading like ripples in still water, far beyond what we can see. There lived in a farming village a man named Tarun, whose fields lay at the edge of the settlement, where the good soil met the rocky ground that led up into the hills. His land was not the best in the village. It was a bit too steep, a bit too stony, the kind of place where crops would grow if you worked hard enough, but where the work was always harder than it needed to be. Tarun was not a lazy man, but he was not particularly industrious either. He did what was necessary to get by, but rarely more than that. When his neighbors were mending their fences in the early spring, Tarun would wait until his livestock had already gotten into someone else's field before fixing his own barriers. When others were preparing their fields with careful plowing and fertilizing, Tarun would do the minimum required to plant his seeds and hope for good weather to make up for his lack of effort. This approach to farming meant that Tarun's harvests were usually smaller than his neighbors, and his income was correspondingly modest. He had enough to feed his family and pay his basic obligations, but never quite enough to improve his situation significantly. Every year he promised himself that next season he would work harder, plan better, be more diligent. And every year, when the time came for that extra effort, he found reasons to put it off. The spring that our story takes place, Tarun found himself facing a problem that his usual half measures couldn't solve. The wooden plow he had inherited from his father had finally broken beyond repair, splitting along a crack that had been growing wider for several seasons. A new plow was expensive, more expensive than Tarun had saved, more expensive than he could afford if he wanted to have money left for seeds and other necessities. His neighbor Mohan, whose fields adjoined Tarun's, and who was known throughout the village for both his generous nature and his excellent farming, owned 2 plows. One was his everyday tool, well-maintained and perfectly suited to his needs. The other was older, a backup that he kept in his barn in case something happened to his primary plow. When word spread that Tarun needed equipment for the spring planting, Mohan approached him with an offer. "Tarun," Mohan said one morning as they both stood looking at their fields in the early light, "I heard about your plow. I have a spare that you're welcome to borrow for the season. It's not as fine as my regular one, but it's solid and will serve you well." Tarun felt a rush of relief and gratitude. This was exactly the kind of help he needed, temporary, practical, and free. "That's very generous of you, Mohan. I would be grateful to borrow it." "There's just one thing," Mohan continued. "I'll need it back by harvest time. My brother from the next village usually comes to help me bring in the crops, and he'll need to borrow this second plow for his own fields immediately after our harvest is complete. So I'll need it back in good condition by then." "Of course," Tarun agreed immediately. "I'll return it in perfect condition as soon as my harvest is done. You have my word." They shook hands on the agreement, and the next day Mohan helped Tarun carry the borrowed plow to his fields. It was indeed a good tool, perhaps not quite as sharp or as smoothly balanced as Mohan's primary plow, but far better than anything Tarun could have afforded to buy. With this equipment, he was able to prepare his fields more thoroughly than he had in years, and his crops promised to be correspondingly better. Throughout the growing season, Tarun used the borrowed plow for various tasks, breaking up clods that the rain had hardened, creating furrows for drainage, preparing small sections for late-planted vegetables. Each time he used it, he was reminded of Mohan's generosity and of his own promise to return it in good condition when harvest time came. As the months passed and the crops grew tall and healthy, Tarun began to feel optimistic about his prospects. This was shaping up to be his best harvest in several years, thanks in large part to the thorough field preparation the borrowed plow had made possible. The grain was full and heavy, the vegetables were abundant, and he began to calculate that he might actually have enough money left over after expenses to buy his own plow for next season. But then, as often happens with such calculations, reality proved more complicated than hope. When harvest time arrived and Tarun began to bring in his crops, he discovered that his estimates had been too optimistic. Yes, the harvest was good, better than usual, but the costs of seeds, of hired help for the busiest days, of repairs to his storage buildings, of all the small expenses that farming requires, were also higher than he had planned. After selling his grain and vegetables, after paying his debts and setting aside what he needed for his family's winter provisions, Tarun found himself with barely enough money to cover his basic needs for the coming year. Certainly not enough to buy a plow of his own. Without the borrowed plow, he would be back to his old problem, unable to prepare his fields properly for next season. It was at this point that a small dishonesty began to grow in Tarun's mind, like a weed in fertile soil. He began to think about how Mohan might not really need the plow back right away. After all, Mohan's own harvest was proceeding smoothly with his primary plow. And his brother from the next village, well, perhaps his brother had found another solution, or perhaps his need wasn't as urgent as originally thought. Surely Mohan, who was so generous and understanding, wouldn't mind if Tarun kept the plow just a little longer. Just until spring, perhaps, when Tarun would have had time to earn the money for his own equipment. The more Tarun thought about it, the more reasonable this delay seemed. He wasn't stealing the plow. He was simply extending the loan a bit longer than originally agreed. He would return it eventually, certainly before Mohan really needed it. This wasn't dishonesty, he told himself. This was just flexibility. A small adjustment to their arrangement that would benefit everyone in the long run. When Mohan came by to collect the plow at the agreed time, Tarun was ready with his explanation. "Mohan, my friend," he said, stepping out to meet his neighbor before Mohan could reach the barn where the plow was stored. "I need to ask you a favor about the plow." "Of course," Mohan replied, though something in Tarun's manner made him pause. "What is it?" "My harvest ran later than I expected," Tarun said, the words coming easier than he had anticipated. "I still need the plow for a few more days to finish clearing the last section of field. Would it be possible to return it to you next week instead?" This was not entirely untrue. There was indeed a section of field that could benefit from additional work. But it wasn't essential work, and it certainly didn't require the plow for several more days. Tarun was surprised at how smoothly the partial truth came from his lips. Mohan looked concerned. "Next week? But I promised my brother he could collect it immediately after our harvest finished. He's planning to come for it in 3 days." "Just a few extra days," Tarun pressed. "Surely your brother could wait just a little longer. Or perhaps he has other equipment he could use temporarily." Mohan was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with the situation. He was a man who kept his promises, and he had given his word to his brother. But he was also reluctant to press Tarun if the plow was truly needed for essential work. "Well," Mohan said finally, "I suppose I could ask my brother to delay his trip by a week. But I really will need it back then, Tarun. I gave him my word." "Absolutely," Tarun said, relief flooding through him. "1 week. You have my promise." But as Mohan walked away, something had changed in the quality of their interaction. The easy friendship, the natural trust that had characterized their relationship for years, had acquired a small crack. Mohan found himself wondering why Tarun hadn't mentioned this scheduling problem earlier, why he had waited until the last moment to ask for an extension. And Tarun, though he had gotten what he wanted, felt the weight of that first small deception settling into his chest like a stone. 1 week passed, and then another, and still the plow remained in Tarun's barn. When Mohan came to ask about it, Tarun had new excuses ready. His back was bothering him, and he needed a few more days to finish the work. Then it was the weather, too wet to work in the fields, but as soon as it cleared, he would complete his tasks and return the plow immediately. Then it was a problem with his storage shed that required urgent attention before winter set in. Each excuse was plausible, taken individually. Each contained elements of truth, but together, they formed a pattern that even Tarun could no longer deny to himself. He was not planning to return the plow anytime soon. He was keeping it because he needed it, because returning it would create problems for him, because he had convinced himself that his need was greater than Mohan's. The excuses grew more elaborate as the weeks passed. Tarun found himself planning his explanations in advance, rehearsing them, until they sounded natural and reasonable. He began to avoid places where he might encounter Mohan unexpectedly, taking longer routes to the market, timing his errands to minimize the chance of awkward meetings. When they did meet, Tarun would quickly raise the subject of the plow himself, offering detailed explanations of why he still needed it, promising specific dates for its return that he had no intention of keeping. Mohan, for his part, grew increasingly frustrated and bewildered. He had already disappointed his brother twice, forcing him to delay his own planting and borrow inferior equipment from someone else. The easy trust he had always felt in his dealings with Tarun was eroding, replaced by a watchful uncertainty that made every interaction between them strained and uncomfortable. Winter came, and the plow sat unused in Tarun's barn. There was no field work to be done in the frozen months, no plausible excuse for keeping the tool. But by now, returning it had become more difficult than keeping it. How could he explain why he had needed it for so long? How could he face Mohan's questions about what essential work had required months to complete? It seemed easier to wait until spring, when he could return the plow and claim he had been storing it safely through the winter months. But spring brought its own complications. Other farmers began preparing their fields, and it became obvious that Tarun was using the borrowed plow for his own spring planting. When Mohan saw him working his fields with the familiar tool, their eyes met across the distance, and no words were needed to communicate what both men understood. The loan had become a theft. The temporary arrangement had become permanent. The friendship that had existed between them for years had been sacrificed for the sake of a farming implement. The consequences of this small dishonesty began to spread through the village like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Other farmers noticed the tension between Mohan and Tarun. They saw Tarun using equipment that everyone knew belonged to his neighbor. They heard Mohan's careful, diplomatic explanations of why he could no longer make certain promises or offer certain help to others. Word spread that Tarun was not trustworthy, that his word could not be relied upon, that lending him anything was likely to be the same as giving it away. People began to treat Tarun differently. When he needed to borrow tools or hire help for tasks he couldn't manage alone, he found fewer options available. Neighbors who had previously been happy to share equipment or trade labor became busy or unavailable when he approached them. His reputation for reliability, built up over years of small interactions and kept promises, crumbled in the space of a single growing season. But the heaviest burden was not the social consequences. It was the weight that Tarun carried inside himself, the constant awareness of his own deception. Every morning when he saw the plow in his barn, he was reminded of his betrayal of Mohan's trust. Every time he used it, he felt the discomfort of working with stolen equipment. Every evening he went to sleep knowing that he was living a lie, maintaining a pretense that grew more complicated and burdensome with each passing day. The worst part was how natural the deception had become. What had started as a single moment of dishonesty, the decision to ask for an extension he didn't really need, had grown into a complex web of ongoing lies that required constant maintenance. Tarun found himself automatically crafting excuses, instinctively avoiding uncomfortable encounters, naturally choosing the dishonest path whenever truth would be inconvenient. The small seed of deception had grown into a tree whose branches reached into every aspect of his life. One day in late spring, as Tarun was using the borrowed plow to prepare a section of field for planting, the tool broke. Not catastrophically, just a simple crack in the wooden handle that made it difficult to use effectively. It was the kind of damage that happens to any well-used farming implement, the kind of wear that could easily be repaired by a skilled carpenter. But for Tarun, staring at the damaged plow in his hands, this moment of breakage felt like a judgment. Here was physical evidence of the harm his deception had caused. Not only had he stolen his neighbor's trust and damaged his own integrity, but now he had also damaged the very object that had been the source and symbol of his dishonesty. He could have the plow repaired, of course. He could fix it and return it to Mohan with some explanation about the wear it had sustained during its storage in his barn. But looking at the cracked handle, Tarun realized that the plow's condition was a perfect reflection of his own situation. Like the tool in his hands, something essential in his life had broken. Like the wooden handle, his relationships, his reputation, and his peace of mind had developed cracks that might be repaired, but would never be quite the same. Rest here for a moment. Notice how your breath moves naturally, without effort, without planning. Each breath is complete in itself, requiring nothing from you except the simple allowing of what is already happening. There is wisdom in this natural rhythm, this effortless flow of giving and receiving. Let your shoulders soften. Let your jaw relax. You are held here, supported exactly as you are. As Tarun stood in his field, holding the broken plow and feeling the weight of his accumulated deceptions, he heard footsteps on the path that led from the village to his farm. Someone was coming to visit, and given his recent isolation from his neighbors, visitors had become rare. His first impulse was to hide the damaged plow, to avoid another uncomfortable conversation about equipment he should have returned months ago. But something in the quality of the footsteps, steady, unhurried, purposeful, but not aggressive, made him pause. When he looked up, he saw a figure approaching that he didn't immediately recognize. An elderly woman, walking with the aid of a staff, her gray hair braided simply down her back, her clothes clean but worn from travel. As she drew closer, Tarun realized this was not someone from his village. She had the look of a wandering teacher, one of those wise women who traveled from place to place, sharing Buddhist teachings with whoever would listen. Such teachers appeared occasionally in their region, staying for a few days or weeks before continuing on their journeys, leaving behind seeds of wisdom that would grow long after they were gone. "Good morning," the woman called as she approached. "I am Pema. I have been walking since dawn and hoped I might rest in your shade for a few moments." Tarun looked around his field, realizing that there were few trees nearby and that the shade she spoke of was metaphorical. She was asking for the kind of refuge that one human being can offer another, the simple hospitality of acknowledgement and welcome. "Of course," he replied, setting down the broken plow and walking to meet her. "You are welcome to rest as long as you need." Pema's eyes took in the scene around them, the partially plowed field, the farming tools scattered about, the broken plow lying in the furrow where Tarun had been working. But her gaze was observational rather than judgmental, interested rather than critical. "You work hard," she observed, settling onto a fallen log at the edge of the field and setting her staff beside her. "But something troubles you. I can see it in the way you hold your shoulders, hear it in your voice." Tarun was surprised by her directness. Most people, especially strangers, did not immediately point to distress that he thought he was hiding well. But there was something about this woman's manner that invited honesty rather than defensiveness. "It has been a difficult season," he said carefully. "In what way?" The question was simple, but it opened something in Tarun that he had been keeping tightly closed for months. Perhaps it was because she was a stranger, someone who had no history with him and no investment in the village gossip that surrounded his situation. Perhaps it was because she was a teacher, someone whose role was to listen and guide rather than judge. Or perhaps it was simply because he had been carrying his burden alone for so long that the opportunity to speak truth to someone felt like water in a drought. "I borrowed something from a neighbor," he began slowly. "It was meant to be temporary, just for one season. But when the time came to return it, I found reasons to keep it longer." Pema nodded, her expression neither surprised nor disapproving. "And now? Now it has been almost a year. The neighbor has asked for it back many times. I have made many promises to return it, but I keep finding excuses to delay, reasons why I still need it, explanations for why it's not convenient just yet." "I see. And how does this feel in your heart?" The question was so simple, so direct, that it cut through all of Tarun's elaborate justifications and excuses like a blade through cloth. How did it feel in his heart? It felt terrible. It felt like carrying a stone in his chest every moment of every day. It felt like being trapped in a cage of his own making, with bars forged from his own dishonesty. "It feels heavy," he said quietly. "Like something is always wrong, always incomplete, like I can never rest because I'm always maintaining a lie." "Ah," Pema said, and in that single sound Tarun heard recognition and understanding. "You have discovered one of the Buddha's great teachings about suffering." "What do you mean?" "The Buddha taught that much of our suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from our resistance to what is true. When we lie, to others or to ourselves, we create a kind of inner friction, a constant tension between what is real and what we pretend is real. This friction wears us down like a stone wearing away under constant water." Tarun looked at the broken plow lying in the furrow, its cracked handle a perfect symbol of what his deception had cost him. "I wanted to avoid the discomfort of admitting I couldn't afford my own plow. I thought keeping this one would solve my problem. And instead, I created a bigger problem. Not just the practical problem of having a damaged tool, but the spiritual problem of living dishonestly. I've lost my neighbor's trust, damaged my reputation in the village, and worst of all, I've lost respect for myself." Pema was quiet for a moment, her eyes following the flight of a bird across the blue sky above them. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle but clear. "Tell me, when you first borrowed the plow, what was your neighbor's intention?" "He wanted to help me. He saw that I needed equipment for the spring planting, and he offered what he had freely, generously." "And what was your intention when you accepted?" "I intended to use it for the season and return it as promised. I was grateful for his kindness. So both of you began with good intentions. He to give help, you to receive it gratefully and return it as agreed." "Yes." "Then what changed?" Tarun considered this question, tracing the path from his original gratitude to his current situation. "I became afraid. When it came time to return the plow, I was afraid of being without equipment again, afraid of facing another season with inadequate tools. My fear made me selfish." "Fear often does this," Pema agreed. "It makes us forget our connections to others, makes us focus only on our own needs and concerns. But tell me, in all these months of keeping the plow, has your fear been reduced?" The question struck Tarun like a physical blow. In all his rationalizations and justifications, he had never asked himself this fundamental question. Had keeping the plow actually solved the problem it was meant to solve? "No," he said slowly. "If anything, my fear has grown worse. Now I'm not just afraid of being without equipment. I'm afraid of facing my neighbor's anger, afraid of the village gossip, afraid of admitting what I've done. And I'm afraid that even if I return the plow now, the damage to our relationship can't be repaired. So the very action you took to reduce your fear has actually multiplied your fears. Yes, this too is something the Buddha understood deeply. He taught that when we act from fear or grasping, trying to hold on to what we think will make us secure, we often create the very insecurity we were trying to avoid. This story shows us how small dishonesty creates large suffering, spreading through our lives like cracks through stone. Tarun discovered that what began as a moment of fear grew into months of deception, each lie requiring more lies to support it. Buddhism teaches that our actions have consequences that extend far beyond what we can see at the time we act. When we choose dishonesty to avoid temporary discomfort, we often create permanent damage to our relationships, our reputation, and most importantly, our own peace of mind. Let us explore yet another story, one that shows us how we often suffer not from what others think of us, but from what we imagine they think of us. In a town known for its excellent tea, where the hillsides were terraced with carefully tended bushes that produced leaves of exceptional quality, there lived a woman named Keiko, who had inherited her family's tea shop from her grandmother. The shop occupied a corner building on the main street of the town, with large windows that let in the morning light and a wooden sign that had weathered to a soft gray after decades of sun and rain. Keiko's grandmother had been beloved in the community, known not only for her skill in selecting and preparing tea, but also for her warmth and generosity. She had given credit to families going through hard times, had always had a kind word, and often a free cup of tea for anyone who seemed troubled, and had taught dozens of young people the subtle arts of tea preparation and appreciation. When she died, the entire town mourned, and many people wondered whether Keiko would be able to maintain the same standards and continue the same traditions. Keiko herself wondered the same thing. She had learned much from her grandmother, had worked in the shop since she was a child, and understood both the practical and spiritual aspects of tea craft. But she lacked her grandmother's natural ease with people, her instinctive ability to make every customer feel welcomed and valued. Keiko was more reserved by nature, more careful in her interactions, less quick to offer the kind of spontaneous generosity that had made her grandmother so beloved. In the first months after taking over the shop, Keiko worked harder than she had ever worked in her life. She arrived early to arrange the tea displays perfectly, stayed late to clean every surface until it gleamed, and spent her evenings studying tea preparation techniques and practicing the precise movements that would create the perfect cup. She was determined to prove that she was worthy of her inheritance, that she could maintain the shop's reputation for excellence. But despite her efforts, Keiko began to notice changes in how customers interacted with her. Where they had lingered to chat with her grandmother, sharing news and gossip and personal concerns, they seemed to conduct their business with Keiko more quickly, more formally. Where they had once asked her grandmother for advice about tea selection or preparation, they seemed to assume that Keiko's recommendations were adequate, but not exceptional. Most troubling of all, some customers who had been regular visitors for years began coming less frequently, and a few stopped coming altogether. Keiko told herself that this was natural, that it would take time for people to adjust to the change, that she needed to be patient while building her own relationships with the community. But as weeks turned to months and the pattern continued, she began to imagine what people might be saying about her and her management of the shop. She pictured customers meeting in the market and discussing how the tea shop wasn't what it used to be. She imagined them comparing her unfavorably to her grandmother, noting how much less welcoming the atmosphere had become. She visualized groups of women shaking their heads sadly as they talked about how quickly the old woman's legacy was being diminished by her inexperienced granddaughter. These imaginary conversations became more detailed and more painful the more Keiko dwelt on them. In her mind, she could hear customers complaining that the tea wasn't as carefully selected as before, that the shop wasn't as clean, that the service wasn't as friendly. She invented entire scenarios in which regular customers explained to their friends why they had started buying their tea elsewhere, describing in precise detail everything that Keiko was doing wrong. The more she imagined these conversations, the more anxious she became in her actual interactions with customers. She found herself studying their faces for signs of disapproval, analyzing their tone of voice for hints of criticism, interpreting their body language as evidence that they were dissatisfied with her service. A customer who seemed distracted might be thinking about how much better her grandmother had been. A customer who didn't smile might be regretting their decision to continue patronizing the shop. A customer who left quickly might be eager to escape the awkwardness of dealing with someone so obviously inferior to her predecessor. This anxiety began to affect Keiko's behavior in ways that created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Worried that customers found her unfriendly, she became more withdrawn and formal in her interactions. Convinced that people were comparing her unfavorably to her grandmother, she stopped trying to engage in the kind of casual conversation that had made the shop feel like a community gathering place. Certain that customers were disappointed in the quality of her service, she became so focused on avoiding mistakes that she lost the natural flow and intuitive responsiveness that had been developing in her work. The shop began to feel different, not because Keiko lacked skill or dedication, but because her fear of judgment had created an atmosphere of tension and self-consciousness that customers could sense even if they couldn't identify. The warm, welcoming environment that her grandmother had created was replaced by something more cautious and constrained, more professional, perhaps, but less human. Customers began to notice this change, though they might not have been able to articulate exactly what felt different. Where once they had felt invited to linger and enjoy the experience of selecting tea, now they felt a subtle pressure to make their choices quickly and leave. Where once the shop had felt like a place where they were genuinely welcome, now it felt more like a business transaction where their presence was tolerated rather than appreciated. The irony, which Keiko could not see from inside her anxiety, was that most customers had no intention of comparing her to her grandmother or finding her lacking. They understood that she was young, that she was learning, that it would take time for her to develop her own style and confidence. Many of them actually admired her dedication and hard work, and several had commented to their friends about how impressed they were with her commitment to maintaining the shop's quality. But Keiko heard none of these positive comments because she had become so focused on looking for signs of disapproval that she couldn't recognize approval when it appeared. She interpreted neutral expressions as disappointed, polite comments as merely courteous, and genuine compliments as people being kind to someone they pitied. Her fear of judgment had created a filter through which she could only perceive criticism, whether real or imagined. One particularly difficult morning, after a customer had left without engaging in any conversation beyond the necessary exchange about tea selection and payment, Keiko found herself standing alone in her shop, surrounded by the beautiful displays she had created and the carefully maintained equipment her grandmother had left her, feeling like a failure in the middle of everything she should have been proud of. It was at that moment that she heard a gentle knock on the shop's back door, the entrance that led to the small courtyard where tea was sometimes served on pleasant days. This was unusual. Customers always used the front entrance, and deliveries were scheduled for later in the week. Curious, Keiko walked through the narrow hallway that connected the main shop to the back door. When she opened it, she found an elderly man standing in the courtyard, his simple robe suggesting he was a traveling monk, his weathered face kind but serious. He carried a walking stick carved from bamboo and a small cloth bag that seemed to contain all his possessions. "Good morning," he said with a slight bow. "I am Jishin. I knew your grandmother many years ago, and I have just learned of her passing. I hoped I might be permitted to sit quietly in her tea shop for a few moments to honor her memory." Keiko felt a complex mixture of emotions at this request. Relief at meeting someone who had known and appreciated her grandmother. Anxiety about whether she could properly honor a guest who had such connections to the shop's history. Curiosity about what her grandmother had been like in her younger days. And underneath it all, the familiar fear that she would somehow prove inadequate compared to the woman whose place she had taken. "Of course," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Please, come in. Would you like some tea?" "That would be very kind." As Keiko led Jishin through the hallway into the main shop, she found herself seeing the space through his eyes, someone who had known it in her grandmother's time, who could make direct comparisons between then and now. She noticed dust on a shelf she had somehow missed in her morning cleaning, a slight disarray in the display of tea tins, a small stain on the counter that she had been meaning to address. All the imperfections that she usually managed to ignore seemed to leap out at her now, evidence of how far she had fallen short of her grandmother's standards. Jishin settled onto one of the low stools near the window, where customers could sit while sampling teas. His movements were careful but fluid, suggesting someone accustomed to finding comfort in simple circumstances. He looked around the shop with interest, taking in the changes Keiko had made along with the elements that remained unchanged from her grandmother's time. "You have maintained the essential spirit of this place," he said as Keiko began preparing tea. "I can feel her presence here still." Keiko paused in her preparations, surprised by this observation. She had been so focused on the differences between her management and her grandmother's that she hadn't considered what might have remained the same. "Do you really think so? I sometimes worry that I've changed too much, that I'm not doing things the way she would have done them." "Tell me," Jishin said, "how do you think your grandmother would have wanted you to run this shop?" The question caught Keiko off guard. She had spent so much time imagining what customers thought of her changes, what the community expected from her, what standards she was failing to meet, that she had rarely asked herself what her grandmother herself would have wanted. "She would have wanted me to serve good tea," Keiko said slowly, continuing her careful preparation as she spoke. "She would have wanted the shop to be a place where people felt welcome. She would have wanted me to treat every customer with respect and kindness." "And do you do these things?" Keiko considered the question honestly. "I try to. I work very hard to select the best tea, to prepare it properly, to keep the shop clean and organized. I'm always polite to customers, always careful to give them what they ask for." "But?" The single word hung in the air like incense, creating space for truth to emerge. Keiko found herself speaking thoughts she had barely acknowledged to herself. "But I'm so worried about doing everything perfectly, so afraid of disappointing people, that I think I've forgotten how to simply be present with them. My grandmother didn't just serve tea. She created moments of connection, opportunities for people to feel seen and valued. I'm so busy trying not to make mistakes that I'm not really seeing the people who come here." Jishin nodded thoughtfully as Keiko placed a cup of perfectly prepared tea before him. He lifted it, inhaled the aroma, and took a small sip, his attention completely focused on the experience. "Excellent tea," he said after a moment. "Your technique is flawless. The temperature is perfect, the timing precise, the flavor clean and bright. Your grandmother would be proud of your skill." But now it was Keiko who offered the single word that invited deeper truth. But I sense that you are not enjoying your own mastery. You perform these actions with great care, but little joy. Why is that? The question pierced something in Keiko that she had been trying to keep protected. She set down the tea implements she had been holding and looked directly at this kind stranger who seemed to see so clearly. "I'm afraid I'm not good enough," she said simply. "I'm afraid that everyone who comes here compares me to my grandmother and finds me lacking. I imagine them talking about how the shop isn't what it used to be, how I don't have her warmth or her natural ability with people. The more I worry about this, the more stiff and awkward I become, which probably makes their imagined criticisms actually true." "Ah," Jishin said, and in that sound Keiko heard the recognition of someone who understood this particular form of suffering. "You are fighting a war with phantoms." "What do you mean?" "You are suffering not from what people think of you, but from what you imagine they think of you. You are defending yourself against attacks that exist only in your mind. This is a very common form of suffering, but also one of the most unnecessary." Keiko felt something stir in her chest, a mixture of relief and skepticism. "But surely people do notice that I'm different from my grandmother. Surely some of them are disappointed." "Perhaps some are. But tell me, how much of your energy goes into imagining these disappointed customers, and how much goes into appreciating the customers who are actually here, actually satisfied, actually grateful for what you offer them?" The question illuminated something that Keiko had never considered. She realized that she could recall in precise detail every neutral expression, every brief interaction, every moment that she had interpreted as evidence of customer dissatisfaction. But she could barely remember the genuine smiles, the sincere thanks, the customers who had specifically complimented her tea or expressed appreciation for her service. "I think I noticed the imaginary criticism much more than the real appreciation," she admitted. "This is like a person who owns a beautiful garden, but spends all her time looking for weeds," Jishin observed. "The flowers are there, growing and blooming, but she cannot see them because her attention is focused entirely on what might be wrong." How do I change that? How do I stop seeing only the weeds? The Buddha taught a very simple practice for this, Jishin said, taking another sip of his tea. When you notice your mind creating stories about what others think of you, ask yourself, is this thought helpful? Is it true? Is it kind? What do you mean? Take the thought that customers are comparing you unfavorably to your grandmother. Is this thought helpful? Does it make you a better tea shop owner, a kinder person, a more skillful practitioner of your craft? Keiko considered this. No. If anything, it makes me worse at all of those things. When I'm worried about being compared, I become more self-conscious and less natural in my interactions. Good. That answers the first question. Now the second. Is this thought true? Do you actually know that customers are making these comparisons and finding you lacking? I assume they are. It seems logical that they would. But do you know this? Have customers actually told you they are disappointed? Have you overheard conversations in which people specifically criticized your management of the shop? Keiko reflected on this more carefully. No. Most of my evidence is things like customers not smiling as much as I think they should, or not staying to chat as long as I imagine they used to. But those could have many explanations that have nothing to do with me. Exactly. So the thought may not be true. And the third question, is this thought kind? Does it treat you with the same compassion you would offer a good friend who was learning a difficult skill? No, Keiko said quietly. I would never speak to a friend the way I speak to myself in my own mind. I would encourage her, remind her that learning takes time, help her see her progress rather than focusing on her mistakes. Then these thoughts fail all 3 tests. They are not helpful, not necessarily true, and not kind. When you notice such thoughts arising, you can simply acknowledge them. I see that my mind is creating stories about judgment again. And then gently return your attention to what is actually happening in this moment. As if summoned by his words, the shop's front door chimed as a customer entered. Keiko felt her familiar anxiety begin to rise. The worry about being observed and found wanting, the self-consciousness about her performance, the tendency to interpret every expression and gesture as evidence of dissatisfaction. But this time, she also heard Jishin's questions in her mind. Is this helpful? Is it true? Is it kind? And for the first time in months, she managed to set aside her internal commentary long enough to simply see the person who had entered her shop. It was Mrs. Yamada, an elderly woman who had been one of her grandmother's regular customers, but whose visits had become less frequent in recent months. Keiko had interpreted this change as evidence that Mrs. Yamada was disappointed with the new management, but now she looked more carefully at the woman's face and posture. Mrs. Yamada moved slowly, with the careful steps of someone whose joints were causing pain. Her breathing was slightly labored, suggesting that even the walk to the tea shop required significant effort. Her clothes, while clean, showed signs of wear that suggested financial constraints. All of this information had been available to Keiko before, but she had been too focused on her own insecurities to see it clearly. Good morning, Mrs. Yamada, Keiko said, and for the first time in months, her greeting was motivated by genuine interest in her customer's well-being rather than anxiety about her own performance. How are you feeling today? Mrs. Yamada's face brightened with surprise and pleasure. Oh, my dear, what a kind question. I've been having some trouble with my knees lately, which makes getting around more difficult than it used to be. But I've been missing your excellent tea, so I decided to make the effort to come in today. I'm so glad you did, Keiko said, and she realized that she truly meant it. Please, sit down and let me bring you something special. I have a new green tea that I think you'll enjoy. It's very gentle, with a natural sweetness that doesn't require any additions. As Keiko prepared the tea, she found herself moving with a different quality of attention. Instead of monitoring her own technique for signs of imperfection, she focused on creating something beautiful for this particular customer, someone who had made a physical effort to visit her shop despite her discomfort. The familiar motions of tea preparation became less about proving her competence and more about expressing care. When she brought the tea to Mrs. Yamada, the older woman's face lit up with genuine appreciation. This smells wonderful, she said, cupping the warm bowl in her hands. And how thoughtful of you to bring it to me here by the window. Your grandmother always knew that I like to watch the street while I drink my tea. She taught me to notice what makes each customer comfortable, Keiko replied, and as she spoke, she realized that this was true. Her grandmother had indeed taught her to observe and respond to individual needs and preferences. Keiko had possessed this knowledge all along. Her anxiety had simply prevented her from using it. You know, Mrs. Yamada said after taking a sip of her tea, I've been meaning to tell you how impressed I am with the way you've maintained this place. It can't be easy, taking over something so established, with so many people watching to see how you'll do. But you've kept everything that was important while adding your own touches. The tea selection is more varied than it used to be, and everything is so beautifully organized. Your grandmother would be very proud. Keiko felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief and recognition. This customer, whom she had imagined was disappointed with her changes, was actually appreciating them. The criticism she had been fearing existed primarily in her own imagination, while the real appreciation had been there all along, waiting for her to be present enough to receive it. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more to me than you might realize." From his seat near the window, Jishin observed this interaction with a slight smile. When Mrs. Yamada had finished her tea and departed with a promise to return soon, he turned to Keiko with a knowing look. "What did you notice?" he asked. "I noticed that she never compared me to my grandmother in the way I was afraid she would," Keiko said thoughtfully. "She acknowledged the transition I'm going through, but she spoke about it as something natural and challenging, rather than something I was failing at. And she had specific compliments about things I've done well, things I couldn't see because I was too busy looking for signs of disapproval." "Yes. And how did it feel to be truly present with her, rather than focused on your own performance?" Keiko considered this question carefully. "It felt like remembering why I wanted to run this shop in the first place. When I was worried about being judged, serving customers felt like a test I might fail. But when I focused on Mrs. Yamada herself, on what would make her experience pleasant and comfortable, serving her felt like a gift I could give." "This is the difference between self-consciousness and selflessness," Jishin said. "When we are focused on how others see us, we become trapped in a prison of our own making. But when we focus on how we can serve others, we find freedom and joy." "But what about the customers who really aren't satisfied? What about the ones who do miss my grandmother and wish things were different?" "They exist too," Jishin acknowledged. "Some people will always prefer what was familiar to them. Some will need time to adjust to changes. Some may simply decide that your style of service doesn't suit them as well as your grandmother's did. This is natural and inevitable." "Doesn't that mean I should worry about their opinions?" "No. It means you should accept that you cannot please everyone, and that trying to do so will prevent you from serving anyone well. Your grandmother didn't please everyone either. No one does. But she focused her energy on being fully present with each person who entered her shop, on offering the best of what she had to give, on creating moments of genuine connection and care. When you do the same, some people will appreciate it and some won't. But you will be living authentically rather than performing for an imaginary audience." The afternoon passed quietly, with several more customers entering the shop. Each time, Keiko practiced the simple discipline Jishin had suggested, noticing when her mind began creating stories about judgment, asking whether those thoughts were helpful, true, and kind, and then returning her attention to the person actually in front of her. She discovered that most interactions were far more pleasant than she had been experiencing them. When she wasn't monitoring herself for signs of inadequacy, she could actually see her customers, their moods, their preferences, their individual humanity. When she wasn't defending against imaginary criticism, she could offer genuine hospitality. When she wasn't performing competence, she could simply be competent. As the day drew toward evening and the last customer departed, Keiko turned to Jishin, who had spent the entire day quietly observing from his corner seat, occasionally accepting refills of tea, but mostly just maintaining a peaceful presence that somehow made the whole shop feel calmer. "I think I understand something now that I didn't understand this morning," she said. "What is that?" "I thought my problem was that I wasn't as good as my grandmother, that people were noticing this and finding me lacking. But the real problem was that I was so afraid of being found lacking that I couldn't be present enough to offer what I actually have to give. My fear of judgment was creating the very distance and artificiality that I was afraid people would notice. Yes, Jishin said with a satisfied nod. This is a very important understanding. The Buddha taught that our suffering often comes not from external circumstances, but from our resistance to those circumstances. You were not suffering because you are different from your grandmother. You were suffering because you were resisting being different from your grandmother. What's the difference? When we accept what is true, that you are learning, that you have your own gifts and limitations, that some people will appreciate your approach and others won't, we can work with reality as it is. When we resist what is true, we exhaust ourselves fighting against things we cannot change. Let us pause here again. Notice how your breath has been flowing throughout this entire conversation, supporting you without your conscious effort, giving you exactly what you need in each moment. There is no need to improve your breathing, no need to make it different from what it is. It is perfect as it is, just as you are perfect as you are, with all your questions and uncertainties. Feel the weight of your body settling into whatever supports it. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to accomplish. This moment is complete. This story shows us how we often torture ourselves with imaginary judgments, creating suffering from thoughts that exist only in our minds. Keiko discovered that her fear of being compared to her grandmother was causing more problems than any actual comparisons. Buddhism teaches that much of our pain comes not from what others think of us, but from what we imagine they think of us. When we focus our attention on the people actually in front of us, rather than the critics in our heads, we often find that reality is much kinder than our fears. Let us explore one more teaching tonight, a story that reveals how our attempts to control our image often create the very problems we're trying to avoid. In a mountain village where the houses climbed the hillsides like steps carved from stone, where the air was thin and clear, and every morning brought the sound of bells from the temple at the village's heart, there lived a man named Hiroshi who worked as a carpenter. His workshop occupied the ground floor of his house, and from its windows he could see the narrow paths that wound between the terraced gardens where his neighbors grew vegetables and medicinal herbs. Hiroshi had learned his craft well over many years of practice. He could join wood without nails, create furniture that would last for generations, and repair structures that lesser craftsmen would have declared hopeless. His work was solid, functional, and built to endure the harsh mountain weather that could split inferior wood and loosen poorly made joints. But Hiroshi had one weakness that compromised all his strengths. He cared too much about appearing perfect in the eyes of others. He wanted to be seen not just as competent, but as the most skilled carpenter in the region. He wanted people to speak of his work with admiration, to recommend him to their friends and relatives, to regard him as a master of his craft whose reputation was without blemish. This desire for a perfect reputation led Hiroshi to make promises that were difficult to keep. When customers asked if he could complete their projects by certain dates, he would confidently assure them that their timeline was no problem, even when he knew the work would require more time than they were allowing. When people inquired whether he could handle jobs that were beyond his current skill level, he would claim expertise he didn't yet possess, rather than admit the limits of his knowledge. When clients asked for price estimates, he would quote figures that were lower than what the work would actually cost, hoping to win their business and figure out the financial details later. In each case, Hiroshi's motivation was the same. He wanted to appear capable, reliable, and superior to his competitors. He believed that admitting any limitations or uncertainties would damage his reputation and cost him business, so he consistently presented himself as more capable than he actually was, promising more than he could deliver, and creating expectations that he would struggle to meet. At first, this strategy seemed to work. Customers were impressed by his confidence and his willingness to take on challenging projects with tight deadlines and reasonable prices. Word spread that Hiroshi was a carpenter who could handle anything, who never said no to a project, who was both skilled and affordable. His business grew rapidly, and he found himself busier than he had ever been. But promises made rashly must still be kept carefully, and Hiroshi soon discovered that his eagerness to appear perfect was creating impossible demands on his time and energy. Projects that he had confidently promised to complete in 2 weeks actually required a month of careful work. Jobs that he had claimed were simple turned out to require techniques he had never mastered. Prices that he had quoted to win business left him barely covering the cost of materials, let alone compensating himself fairly for his labor. As his commitments accumulated and his deadlines approached, Hiroshi found himself working longer hours than ever before, often continuing his carpentry late into the night by lamplight, sacrificing sleep and health to maintain his reputation for reliability. But even these heroic efforts couldn't solve the fundamental problem. He had promised more than was humanly possible to deliver. The first cracks in his perfect image appeared when Mrs. Sato's kitchen table, which he had promised to complete before her daughter's wedding celebration, remained unfinished 2 days before the event. Hiroshi had encountered unexpected problems with the wood. Knots that were harder than anticipated, grain that split when he tried to work it in certain ways, joints that required more precision than he had initially calculated. Rather than admitting these difficulties and explaining why the work was taking longer than expected, Hiroshi chose to maintain his facade of competence. When Mrs. Sato came to check on the progress, he assured her that everything was on schedule and that the table would be ready as promised. But privately, he knew this was impossible unless he could somehow work miracles in the remaining 2 days. The night before the wedding, Hiroshi was still in his workshop, exhausted and desperate, trying to force together joints that weren't quite right, applying finish to wood that wasn't quite ready, cutting corners that he would never have cut if he had allowed himself adequate time. The table he delivered the next morning was functional, but it bore the marks of rushed work, slightly uneven legs, a surface that wasn't perfectly smooth, joints that were secure but not elegant. Mrs. Sato accepted the table graciously, understanding that wedding preparations were stressful for everyone involved. But Hiroshi could see the disappointment in her eyes, the recognition that the finished product didn't match the quality she had expected based on his reputation. She paid him without complaint, but he knew that she would not be recommending his services to her friends. This experience should have taught Hiroshi to be more realistic in his promises, but instead, it convinced him that he needed to work even harder to maintain his image. He began taking on even more projects, reasoning that a higher volume of satisfied customers would compensate for the occasional disappointment. He promised even faster completion times, hoping to impress clients with his efficiency. He quoted even lower prices, trying to make his services irresistible, despite the growing evidence that his work was suffering from time pressure. The predictable result was that his problems multiplied rather than resolved. With more projects competing for his limited time, each one received less attention than it deserved. With faster deadlines, he had even less opportunity to handle unexpected challenges thoughtfully. With lower profit margins, he couldn't afford to buy the highest quality materials or invest in better tools that might have improved his efficiency. Hiroshi's workshop, which had once been organized and peaceful, became chaotic and stressful. Half-finished projects competed for space with raw materials ordered for upcoming jobs. Tools were left scattered rather than properly maintained because he never had time for the careful cleanup that good craftsmanship requires. The sawdust that accumulated faster than he could sweep it away seemed to symbolize how his life was getting away from him. His relationships with customers became increasingly tense as delays and quality issues became more common. People who had hired him, based on his confident promises, grew frustrated when those promises weren't kept. Hiroshi found himself spending more and more time making excuses and managing disappointed clients rather than focusing on the carpentry work itself. The worst part was the constant anxiety that consumed him. Every morning when he woke, he felt the weight of all his outstanding commitments, all the promises he had made that he wasn't sure he could keep. Every interaction with a customer carried the fear that they would discover how overwhelmed he was, how much he was struggling to maintain the image of competence he had created. Every project became a source of stress rather than satisfaction as he worried about whether he could complete it to the standards he had claimed he could meet. Sleep became difficult as his mind raced through lists of tasks that needed to be completed, problems that needed to be solved, explanations that he would need to give to customers whose expectations he was failing to meet. The joy that had originally drawn him to carpentry, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional with his hands, the pleasure of seeing a project take shape through careful work, had been completely overwhelmed by the stress of maintaining an impossible schedule driven by an impossible image. One autumn morning, as Hiroshi stood in his cluttered workshop surrounded by half-finished projects and broken promises, he heard a commotion in the street outside. Voices were raised, not in anger, but in excitement, and he could hear people calling to their neighbors to come and see something. Despite his overwhelming workload, curiosity drew him to his window. Walking slowly up the mountain path that led to their village was a figure that Hiroshi had heard about but never seen. Master Kobun, the legendary carpenter whose work adorned the most important temples and palaces throughout the region. He was an elderly man, walking with a simple staff, carrying only a small bag of tools and a roll of well-worn blueprints. His reputation was so great that other carpenters would travel for days just to observe him work, hoping to learn even a fraction of his techniques. The village headman had hurried down from his house to greet this unexpected visitor, and soon a small crowd had gathered around Master Kobun, everyone eager to hear why such a famous craftsman had come to their remote mountain community. Hiroshi watched from his window, fascinated despite his anxiety, wondering what business could have brought this legendary figure to their humble village. "I have come," Master Kobun explained to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air, "because I heard that this village has a carpenter skilled enough to help me with a special project. The temple in the valley below has commissioned me to create a meditation hall, and I need an assistant who understands mountain wood and mountain weather. Someone told me there is a craftsman here whose work is exceptional." The crowd immediately began discussing who this might be. There were several carpenters in the village, each with their own specialties and reputations. But as the conversation continued, it became clear that many people were thinking of Hiroshi. His name came up repeatedly as someone whose work was known for its durability and precision, someone who had successfully completed many challenging projects. Hiroshi felt a complex mixture of emotions as he listened to his neighbors speaking about his abilities with such respect. On one hand, he was gratified to hear that his reputation extended beyond his immediate customers, that Master Kobun himself had heard favorable reports of his work. On the other hand, He was acutely aware of how far his current reality fell short of this glowing description. How could he present himself to a legendary master when his workshop was in chaos, when he was behind schedule on multiple projects, when his most recent work showed clear signs of being rushed and compromised? But the opportunity was too significant to ignore. Working with Master Kobun would be the pinnacle of his career, a chance to learn techniques that were closely guarded secrets, a collaboration that would enhance his reputation throughout the region. Surely he could find a way to make this work, to clear his schedule enough to take on this prestigious assignment. When the village headman knocked on his door an hour later to invite him to meet Master Kobun, Hiroshi had already constructed his strategy. He would present only his best work, emphasize his most successful projects, and somehow find a way to conceal the chaos that his workshop had become. He would appear before this master as the skilled, organized, reliable craftsman that his reputation suggested he was. Hiroshi quickly gathered examples of his finest pieces: a jewelry box with intricate joinery, a small table made from a particularly beautiful piece of mountain cherry, a tool handle carved to fit perfectly in the palm of the hand. He hid these items strategically around his workshop to create vignettes of competence, while shoving the evidence of his current struggles into corners where they would be less visible. When Master Kobun arrived at his workshop an hour later, Hiroshi was ready with his carefully crafted presentation. He guided the older man's attention to his best work, spoke confidently about his experience with different types of wood and various construction techniques, and offered detailed opinions about the challenges and opportunities presented by mountain carpentry. Master Kobun listened attentively, asked thoughtful questions, and examined Hiroshi's sample pieces with the careful attention of someone who could recognize quality workmanship at a glance. His questions were specific and technical, testing Hiroshi's knowledge of wood selection, joint construction, and finishing techniques. Hiroshi answered as well as he could, sometimes drawing on knowledge he actually possessed, and sometimes on information he had heard from other craftsmen, but never verified through personal experience. "Your work shows skill and understanding," Master Kobun said finally, setting down the cherry wood table and looking directly at Hiroshi. "The joinery is precise, the proportions are pleasing, and the finish brings out the natural beauty of the wood. I would be honored to work with a craftsman of your abilities." Hiroshi felt a surge of triumph and relief. His strategy had worked. Master Kobun saw him as he wanted to be seen: competent, masterful, worthy of collaboration on an important project. The chaos and stress of his current situation had been successfully hidden behind a facade of professional excellence. "The temple project will require 6 weeks of intensive work," Master Kobun continued. "We would need to start immediately and work without interruption to complete the commission on schedule. The temple is expecting the meditation hall to be ready for a special ceremony at the end of next month. Would you be able to commit to this timeline? 6 weeks of intensive work, starting immediately, without interruption." Hiroshi's mind raced through his current obligations. He had promised Mrs. Chen that her cabinets would be finished by the end of the week. Mr. Fujiwara was expecting his repaired barn doors within 10 days. The merchant from the valley needed his shelving completed before his new inventory arrived. There were at least 4 other projects in various stages of completion, each with customers who were already frustrated by previous delays. But this was Master Kobun. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. Surely he could find a way to manage his existing commitments while taking on this prestigious new work. Perhaps he could delegate some tasks to other carpenters, or negotiate extensions with his current customers, or simply work even longer hours to accommodate everything. "Yes," Hiroshi heard himself say, "I can commit to that timeline. My schedule is flexible enough to accommodate this important project." Master Kobun smiled and extended his hand. "Excellent. We begin tomorrow at dawn." After the master carpenter had left to arrange his accommodation in the village, Hiroshi sat alone in his workshop, surrounded by the evidence of his overwhelming commitments, trying to figure out how to fulfill the promise he had just made. The euphoria of being chosen by Master Kobun was rapidly being replaced by panic about the practical impossibilities his acceptance had created. He spent the entire night moving between his current projects, trying to complete enough work on each one to buy himself time for the temple project. He worked by candlelight, cutting corners wherever possible, using shortcuts that he knew were inferior, but hoped would be adequate. By dawn, he had made progress on several pieces, but nothing was actually completed to the standard that his customers deserved. When Master Kobun arrived at sunrise, carrying his tools and a detailed drawing of the meditation hall they would build together, Hiroshi was exhausted, but determined to maintain his facade of competence. He had cleared a section of his workshop to create space for their collaboration, though the rest of the area remained cluttered with half-finished projects that he hoped the master wouldn't examine too closely. "Before we begin the temple work," Master Kobun said, settling his tools on Hiroshi's workbench, "I like to understand how my collaborators organize their practice. May I look around your workshop?" Hiroshi felt his stomach clench with anxiety, but he couldn't refuse such a reasonable request. "Of course," he said, trying to sound casual. "Please, make yourself at home." Master Kobun moved slowly through the workshop, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. He noticed the projects stacked against the walls, the tools scattered rather than properly arranged, the sawdust that hadn't been swept clean, the general atmosphere of chaos barely contained by hurried organization. Most tellingly, he noticed the quality of the work in progress: joints that were adequate but not excellent, finishes that were rushed, measurements that were approximate rather than precise. "You have many projects underway," he observed neutrally. "Yes, business has been very good lately," Hiroshi replied, hoping this would sound like success rather than poor planning. "And when are these pieces due to your customers?" The question Hiroshi had been dreading. "Various dates," he said vaguely. "Most of them have some flexibility in their timing." Master Kobun picked up a partially completed stool that was destined for Mr. Tanaka's shop. The legs were attached but not properly sanded. The seat was cut but not fitted, and the overall construction showed signs of haste rather than care. "This piece," Master Kobun said thoughtfully, "appears to be in the middle of construction. The customer must be eager to receive it." "Actually, that one is... It's a practice piece," Hiroshi lied, the words coming out more smoothly than he expected. "I was experimenting with some new techniques, not for any particular customer." Master Kobun nodded, but his eyes moved to another unfinished piece, and then another. Each time, Hiroshi found himself creating explanations that moved further and further from the truth. Practice pieces, experiments, work he was doing for his own satisfaction rather than for paying customers. With each lie, he felt the web of deception growing more complex and more fragile. "I see," Master Kobun said finally. "You are a craftsman who values continuous learning. That is admirable. Now, shall we begin work on the temple project?" For the next several hours, Hiroshi worked alongside the legendary master, and the experience was everything he had hoped it would be. Master Kobun's techniques were indeed extraordinary. Methods for selecting wood that Hiroshi had never considered, approaches to joint construction that were both stronger and more elegant than anything he had learned, finishing processes that brought out depths of beauty in common materials that seemed almost magical. But even as he absorbed these valuable teachings, Hiroshi was constantly distracted by anxiety about his other obligations. Every few minutes, his attention would drift from Master Kobun's instructions to mental calculations about his delayed projects, rehearsals of explanations he would need to give to frustrated customers, desperate schemes for completing multiple jobs simultaneously. This divided attention did not go unnoticed. Master Kobun was accustomed to working with apprentices and collaborators who brought their full presence to the task at hand. He could sense when someone was mentally elsewhere, and Hiroshi's scattered focus was becoming increasingly obvious. "Your mind seems to be in many places at once," Master Kobun observed as they paused for tea at midday. "This is not conducive to the kind of precision our work requires." "I'm sorry, Master," Hiroshi said, trying to refocus his attention. "I'm completely dedicated to this project. Sometimes my mind just wanders." "Where does it wander?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than accusation, but it pierced through Hiroshi's carefully maintained composure. He found himself speaking more honestly than he had intended. "I'm thinking about other work that needs to be completed, planning how to manage my time efficiently so that everything gets done properly." "Other work? But you told me your schedule was flexible enough to accommodate this project without interruption." Hiroshi felt trapped by his own earlier claims. "Yes, it is. I just like to plan ahead, to make sure everything runs smoothly." Master Kobun was quiet for a long moment, sipping his tea and gazing out the window at the village below them. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle but serious. "Hiroshi, I have worked with many carpenters over many years, and I have learned to recognize the signs of a craftsman who has overcommitted himself. Your workshop shows evidence of many urgent projects. Your manner shows the stress of someone carrying too many obligations. Your attention shows the fragmentation of someone trying to be in multiple places at once. These are not criticisms, they are observations offered with compassion." Hiroshi felt his carefully constructed image beginning to crumble like wood affected by dry rot. I can manage my commitments. I don't want this to affect our collaboration." "The question is not whether you can manage your commitments," Master Kobun replied. "The question is whether trying to manage impossible commitments is creating suffering for you and poor results for your customers." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from green wood, visible, substantial, impossible to ignore. Hiroshi looked around his workshop with new eyes, seeing clearly for the first time in months the evidence of what his drive for a perfect reputation had actually created. Chaos instead of order, stress instead of satisfaction, rushed work instead of careful craftsmanship, broken promises instead of reliability. "What would you do?" Hiroshi asked quietly. "If you were in my situation?" "I would tell the truth," Master Kobun said simply. "I would acknowledge what is real rather than maintaining what is pretend. But if I admit that I'm overwhelmed, that I've made promises I can't keep, that I'm not as organized and capable as I've claimed to be, won't that destroy my reputation?" Master Kobun smiled, and in his expression, Hiroshi saw decades of experience with the fears and pride that drove craftsmen to make choices that ultimately harmed their work and their well-being. "Let me tell you something about reputation," the master said. "A reputation built on truth can withstand temporary setbacks. A reputation built on pretense will eventually collapse under its own weight, and when it does, the fall will be much more damaging than any temporary admission of limitations would have been." "I don't understand." Consider two possibilities. In the first, you continue as you are, trying to maintain the image of perfect competence while struggling with impossible commitments. What do you think will happen to the quality of your work? What do you think will happen to your relationships with customers when you continue to disappoint them? What do you think will happen to your own peace of mind and joy in your craft? Hiroshi didn't need to think long about these questions. He could already see the trajectory his current path was following, toward increasingly poor workmanship, increasingly frustrated customers, and increasingly unbearable personal stress. Nothing good, he admitted. Now consider the second possibility. You acknowledge that you have overcommitted yourself. You work with your existing customers to create realistic timelines for completion, and you begin to make promises based on what you can actually deliver, rather than what you think people want to hear. What do you think would happen then? Some customers would be disappointed. Some might decide to work with other carpenters. My reputation for being available and accommodating would be damaged. Yes, that's possible. But what about the customers who remained? What about the work you would actually complete? What about your own experience of your craft? Hiroshi considered this scenario more carefully. The customers who stayed would receive better work because I would have adequate time to do it properly. My reputation would be based on what I actually deliver rather than what I promise. And I would probably enjoy carpentry again instead of feeling constantly stressed about it. Which of these two paths leads to genuine success? The question illuminated something that Hiroshi had been too frightened to see clearly. His pursuit of a perfect reputation was actually destroying the reality that reputation was meant to represent. His fear of appearing limited was creating actual limitations that were far more serious than any he would have faced by simply acknowledging his natural human constraints. I think I've been so afraid of having a flawed reputation that I've created genuinely flawed work, he said slowly. Yes. And what do you think would happen if you approached our temple project with this same pattern? If you tried to appear more capable than you are, promised more than you can deliver, hid your limitations rather than working within them? The answer was obvious and terrifying. I would disappoint you the same way I've disappointed my other customers. I would waste this incredible opportunity by trying to be someone I'm not, instead of offering the best of who I actually am. Master Kobun set down his teacup and looked directly at Hiroshi with eyes that were compassionate but unwavering. So what will you choose? The moment stretched between them like a bridge that Hiroshi could either cross or turn away from. On one side was the familiar territory of pretense and performance, the exhausting but known world of maintaining an image that didn't match reality. On the other side was the unknown country of honesty, the risk of being seen as he actually was, rather than as he wanted to appear. I want to choose truth, Hiroshi said finally, but I don't know how to undo the mess I've created. We undo it the same way it was created, Master Kobun replied. One decision at a time, one conversation at a time, one project at a time. That afternoon, Hiroshi began the difficult work of aligning his reality with his promises. He visited Mrs. Chen first, bringing with him her half-completed cabinets and an explanation that was both honest and respectful. Mrs. Chen, he said, setting the cabinet doors carefully on her kitchen table, I need to speak with you about your project. I have not been managing my time well, and I cannot complete your cabinets by the end of this week as I promised. I estimate they will require 2 more weeks of careful work to meet the standard you deserve. Mrs. Chen's initial reaction was frustration. She had planned to have her kitchen organized before her son's visit, and the delay would disrupt her preparations. But as Hiroshi continued, explaining that he wanted to give her work the attention it deserved rather than rushing it to meet an unrealistic deadline, she began to appreciate his honesty. I would rather wait for good cabinets than receive poor ones on schedule, she said after considering his explanation. But I need to know that 2 weeks means 2 weeks, not 2 weeks, plus additional delays when that time arrives. You have my word, Hiroshi replied, and for the first time in months, he made a promise he was confident he could keep. I will complete them properly in 2 weeks, and if I encounter any problems that might cause further delay, I will inform you immediately rather than waiting until the deadline arrives. The conversation with Mr. Fujiwara was more difficult. His barn doors were needed before the winter weather arrived in earnest, and the delay Hiroshi requested would create real problems for protecting his livestock. But even here, honesty proved more effective than Hiroshi had expected. When he explained that rushed work might result in doors that wouldn't properly weatherproof the barn, Mr. Fujiwara agreed that a brief delay was preferable to inadequate protection. Not every customer was as understanding. The merchant from the valley canceled his order entirely, choosing to work with another carpenter who could meet his timeline. A woman who had commissioned a wedding gift decided she couldn't wait for the new completion date and demanded a refund. These losses were painful, but they were also liberating. Each canceled project reduced Hiroshi's impossible workload, creating space for him to focus properly on the commitments that remained. By the end of the week, Hiroshi had restructured his entire schedule based on realistic assessments of how long each project would actually require. Some customers had chosen to wait for better work. Others had decided to seek alternatives. But those who remained knew exactly what to expect and when to expect it. And Hiroshi finally had a workload that he could manage without constant stress and corner cutting. Now, Master Kobun said when Hiroshi reported on his progress, "Are you ready to begin the temple project with full attention?" "Yes," Hiroshi replied, and for the first time in months, he meant what he said completely. The work that followed was unlike anything Hiroshi had ever experienced. Master Kobun's approach to carpentry was simultaneously more demanding and more relaxed than Hiroshi's usual practice. More demanding because every cut, every joint, every decision was considered carefully and executed with precise attention to detail. More relaxed because there was no rushing, no anxiety about deadlines, no pressure to appear more capable than he was. When Hiroshi encountered techniques that were unfamiliar to him, he found himself able to simply say, "I haven't done this before. Would you show me?" Instead of pretending knowledge he didn't possess, he could acknowledge his learning edges and receive instruction without shame. When he made mistakes, he could point them out and ask for guidance on correction rather than trying to hide them and hoping they wouldn't be noticed. Master Kobun proved to be an excellent teacher precisely because he expected honesty from his students. When Hiroshi admitted uncertainty, the master would patiently demonstrate the proper technique and explain the reasoning behind it. When Hiroshi made errors, Master Kobun would show him how to correct them and how to avoid similar problems in the future. But when Hiroshi tried to pretend understanding he didn't possess, the master would immediately recognize the pretense and address it directly. Authentic mastery, Master Kobun explained as they worked together on the intricate roof joinery that would crown the meditation hall, is not about never making mistakes. It is about making mistakes consciously, learning from them openly, and improving through honest practice, rather than hidden struggle. I think I've been confusing mastery with perfectionism, Hiroshi reflected, carefully measuring a beam that needed to fit precisely into the growing structure. I thought being a master meant never having problems, never needing help, never showing uncertainty. True mastery includes knowing the difference between what you know and what you don't know, between what you can do and what you need to learn. A master who pretends to know everything learns nothing. A master who acknowledges his limitations creates space for growth. As the days passed and the meditation hall took shape under their combined efforts, Hiroshi discovered that working with authenticity rather than pretense was not only less stressful, but actually more effective. When he could focus completely on the task at hand instead of worrying about his image, his natural skills emerged more fully. When he could ask questions without shame, he learned techniques that improved his work immediately. When he could admit mistakes quickly, they were corrected before they affected the final result. The other carpenters in the village began to notice changes in Hiroshi's approach to his work. His workshop became more organized as he developed systems that supported focused attention rather than frantic multitasking. His interactions with customers became more honest and therefore more satisfying for both parties. His craftsmanship improved as he had time to work carefully rather than rushing to meet impossible deadlines. Most significantly, his relationships with his neighbors began to heal. When people saw that he was acknowledging his mistakes and working to correct them, when they witnessed him turning down projects that he couldn't handle properly rather than accepting everything that was offered, when they observed him keeping the promises he made instead of making promises he couldn't keep, their trust began to return. The village blacksmith, Master Ito, approached Hiroshi one evening as he was closing his workshop after a productive day of work on both the temple project and his existing commitments. "I've been watching the changes in your work," Master Ito said without preamble. "It's impressive. You seem calmer, more focused, and the quality of what you're producing has improved noticeably." "Thank you," Hiroshi replied, touched by the acknowledgement. "I've been learning to work within my actual limitations rather than pretending I don't have any. That takes courage. It's easier to promise everything than to admit what you can't do." "Easier in the moment," Hiroshi agreed, "but much harder in the long run." "I have a project coming up that might interest you," Master Ito continued. "Some metalwork for the new temple hall that would complement the carpentry you're doing with Master Kobun, but it would require close collaboration, precise timing, and absolute reliability. Would you be interested?" A few months earlier, Hiroshi would have immediately accepted such an offer, without considering whether he could realistically fulfill it. The prospect of working on a prestigious project with another respected master would have overwhelmed his practical judgment. But now, having learned the cost of promises made from ego rather than genuine capacity, he approached the opportunity differently. "It sounds like meaningful work," he said carefully. "Tell me about the timeline and what would be required. I need to consider honestly whether I can give it the attention it deserves." Master Ito smiled at this response, recognizing the wisdom in careful consideration. They spent the next hour discussing the practical details of the potential collaboration, the specific metalwork required, the schedule for integration with the carpentry, the level of precision necessary for proper assembly. Only after Hiroshi had a clear understanding of what would be expected did he make his decision. "Yes, I believe I can commit to this work and do it properly," he said finally. "My schedule will allow me to give it the focused attention it requires, and the technical demands are within my current abilities." "Excellent. I was hoping to work with someone who thinks before promising, rather than promising before thinking." That night, as Hiroshi cleaned and organized his workshop in preparation for the next day's work, he reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. His workload was actually heavier than before. The temple project was demanding, and his remaining customer commitments still required careful attention. But the quality of his experience had transformed completely. Instead of constant anxiety about maintaining an impossible image, he felt the satisfaction of doing work he could be genuinely proud of. Instead of the exhaustion of trying to be everywhere at once, he experienced the focus and flow that came from giving his full attention to one task at a time. Instead of the isolation of carrying deceptions and broken promises, he enjoyed the connection that came from honest relationships with customers and colleagues. The meditation hall was completed exactly on schedule, and the ceremony to consecrate it drew visitors from throughout the region. Hiroshi stood with Master Kobun as monks and lay people alike admired the building they had created together, and he felt a pride that was entirely different from the ego satisfaction he had once craved. This pride was not based on appearing superior to others or on maintaining a perfect image. It was based on the simple fact that he had contributed his honest best to something beautiful and meaningful. Every joint in the building was as strong as he could make it. Every surface was as smooth as his skills allowed. Every detail reflected careful attention and genuine craftsmanship rather than hurried performance. "You have learned something important," Master Kobun said as they packed their tools after the ceremony. "You have discovered the difference between reputation and integrity." "What is the difference?" "Reputation is what others think of you. Integrity is what you actually are. When we focus too much on reputation, we often compromise our integrity. But when we focus on integrity, reputation takes care of itself. I spent so much energy trying to appear perfect that I made my actual work imperfect." Yes. And now you understand why the Buddha taught that suffering comes from attachment to how others see us, attachment to maintaining an image that may not match reality. When we let go of that attachment, we find freedom to be who we actually are and to offer what we actually have. Rest now for a moment. Let your breath move naturally, like water flowing downhill, following the easiest path without effort or planning. There is nothing to force, nothing to control, nothing to make different from what it is. Feel the softness in your body, the places where tension is already beginning to release. You don't need to make this happen. Simply allow what is already happening to continue. This story shows us how our attempts to control our image often create the very problems we're trying to avoid. Hiroshi discovered that his fear of appearing limited was creating actual limitations far more serious than any he would have faced by being honest about his capacities. Buddhism teaches that when we act from ego and attachment to how others see us, we create suffering for ourselves and others. When we focus on integrity rather than image, on what we actually are rather than what we want to appear to be, we find both peace and genuine success. Let us explore one final teaching for tonight, a story that brings together all the threads we have woven and shows us the deepest truth about judgment and self-acceptance. In a region where 3 rivers met and formed a delta, rich with fertile soil and abundant wildlife, there stood a monastery that had served the community for more than 3 centuries. The buildings were simple but beautiful, constructed from local stone and wood, designed to harmonize with the landscape rather than dominate it. Gardens surrounded the main structures, not formal or ornamental, but practical spaces where the monks grew vegetables and medicinal herbs for their own use and to share with needy villagers. Among the monks who lived in this monastery was one named Ananda, a man in his middle years who had taken vows almost 2 decades earlier, after a career as a scholar in the capital city. He had come to monastic life with a deep desire to understand Buddhist teachings, not just intellectually, but experientially, to live the principles he had studied rather than merely thinking about them. Ananda was respected by his fellow monks for his learning and his sincere dedication to practice. He had memorized vast portions of Buddhist scripture, could explain complex philosophical concepts with clarity and precision, and maintained his meditation schedule with admirable consistency. Other monks often came to him with questions about doctrine or requests for help understanding difficult texts. Visiting teachers frequently sought his assistance in preparing talks for the lay people who came to the monastery for instruction. But Ananda carried within himself a secret that he believed would destroy his reputation and position if it were ever discovered. Despite his years of study and practice, despite his reputation for wisdom and insight, despite his role as a teacher and guide to others, he still struggled with anger in ways that he found deeply shameful. The anger was not explosive or violent. It didn't manifest in shouting or aggression or any behavior that others could easily observe. Instead, it was a quiet, persistent irritation that would arise when his routine was disrupted, when other people made choices he considered foolish, when situations developed in ways that seemed inefficient or unnecessary. This anger would burn in his chest like a low fire, sometimes for hours at a time, accompanied by mental commentary that judged and criticized everything around him. Ananda was particularly vulnerable to this anger during the monastery's busy periods, when the regular rhythm of contemplative life was interrupted by festivals, ceremonies, or visits from large groups of lay people. During these times, the peaceful order he cherished would give way to noise and activity that he found deeply disturbing. Children would run through the gardens he helped maintain, stepping on carefully tended plants. Visitors would ask repetitive questions about basic Buddhist concepts that any serious student should have understood. Fellow monks would abandon their usual careful attention to detail in favor of hurried preparations for special events. During these periods, Ananda would maintain his outward composure while internally burning with frustration. He would smile and answer questions while thinking about how ignorant the questioners were. He would help with preparations while mentally criticizing the disorganization around him. He would participate in ceremonies while feeling angry about every deviation from proper protocol. The worst part was how this hidden anger affected his meditation practice. Buddhism teaches that anger is one of the primary obstacles to clear seeing, one of the mental poisons that cloud wisdom and prevent genuine understanding. Ananda knew this intellectually, had taught this principle to others many times, but seemed unable to apply it to his own experience. He would sit in meditation, trying to cultivate the loving kindness and compassion that were central to Buddhist practice, only to find his mind filled with replay loops of all the irritating events from his day. He would attempt to develop equanimity and acceptance, only to discover mental resistance to every aspect of his environment that didn't match his preferences. He would seek the peaceful clarity that meditation was supposed to bring, only to encounter the turbulence of his own judgmental thoughts. This gap between his teaching and his experience created a profound sense of spiritual fraud that ate at Ananda's confidence and peace of mind. How could he guide others in cultivating loving kindness when his own heart was so often filled with criticism? How could he explain the benefits of letting go when he himself clung so tightly to his preferences and opinions? How could he represent Buddhist wisdom when his own practice seemed to be failing in such fundamental ways? Ananda began to live in constant fear that others would discover his spiritual inadequacy. He became hypervigilant about concealing any signs of irritation or judgment, working harder than ever to maintain a facade of perfect equanimity and compassion. When someone asked him a question during a teaching session, he would worry that his answer might reveal some trace of the critical thoughts he had been having. When he participated in group meditation, he would be distracted by anxiety about whether other monks could somehow sense his inner turbulence. This fear of discovery made his anger problems worse rather than better. The stress of constantly monitoring and concealing his emotional reactions added another layer of frustration to his experience. Now he was angry about his anger, judgmental about his judgments, critical of his own criticism. The simple human challenge of dealing with irritation had become a complex psychological prison. Ananda began to isolate himself from his monastic community, choosing individual practice over group activities whenever possible, declining opportunities to teach or lead ceremonies, spending more and more time alone in his cell where he wouldn't risk exposure of his spiritual failings. He told himself and others that he was going through a period of intensive individual practice, that he was preparing for deeper levels of meditation by reducing external distractions. But in reality, his isolation was motivated by shame and fear rather than spiritual aspiration. He was hiding from his community rather than engaging with it, protecting his image rather than developing his practice, choosing the safety of concealment over the risk of authentic spiritual relationship. One morning in early winter, as Ananda sat in his cell attempting morning meditation and finding his mind filled with the familiar litany of critical thoughts about the noise from the kitchen, the inefficiency of the monastery's scheduling, and his own failure to overcome these petty irritations, he heard a soft knock on his door. "Brother Ananda?" called a voice he recognized as belonging to Tenzin, one of the younger monks who had joined the community only 2 years earlier. "The abbot would like to speak with you when your meditation period is complete." Ananda felt his heart rate accelerate with anxiety. Had the abbot noticed his withdrawal from community activities? Had someone reported observing signs of anger or criticism in his behavior? Had his spiritual fraud finally been discovered? "I'll come immediately," he replied, abandoning his failed meditation attempt and rising from his cushion with a sense of dread. The abbot's quarters were simple but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the delta, where the 3 rivers joined their waters in a continuous dance of meeting and parting. The abbot himself was an elderly man whose presence radiated the kind of deep peace that comes from decades of authentic practice, someone who had clearly found genuine resolution to the spiritual challenges that still tormented Ananda. "Please sit," the abbot said, gesturing to a cushion across from his own. "I wanted to check on how you are doing. I've noticed that you've been spending more time in individual practice lately, participating less in our community activities." Ananda felt exposed and vulnerable, but also relieved that the conversation he had been dreading was finally happening. "Yes, Venerable Sir, I've felt called to deepen my individual meditation practice." The abbot studied him with eyes that were both kind and penetrating. "How is that practice going?" The question was simple, but it pierced through all of Ananda's prepared explanations and diplomatic responses. How was his practice going? It was going terribly. He was more frustrated and judgmental than ever. His attempts at meditation were dominated by self-criticism and spiritual anxiety. His isolation was creating more problems than it solved. "Honestly," Ananda said, and the words seemed to open a door that had been locked for months, "it's not going well. I'm struggling with anger and judgment in ways that I find very discouraging. The more I try to fix these problems through individual effort, the worse they seem to become." The abbot nodded with understanding rather than surprise. "Anger is indeed a challenging teacher. Tell me more about how it manifests in your experience." Something in the abbot's manner, the complete absence of shock or disappointment, the matter-of-fact way he referred to anger as a teacher rather than a failure, gave Ananda permission to speak more honestly than he had spoken to anyone in years. I become irritated when our routine is disrupted, when people behave in ways I consider inefficient or thoughtless, when situations don't unfold according to my preferences. I know this anger contradicts everything we teach about acceptance and loving kindness. I know it's a sign of spiritual immaturity. But knowing this intellectually doesn't seem to help me overcome it practically. I see. And how do you typically respond when you notice this anger arising? I try to suppress it, to breathe through it, to remind myself of Buddhist teachings about patience and compassion. When that doesn't work, I withdraw from situations that might trigger it. I've been avoiding community activities because I don't want others to see how judgmental I can be. The abbot was quiet for a moment, gazing out the window at the place where the rivers joined. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of long experience and deep understanding. Ananda, in all your years of study, have you encountered the teaching about the first arrow and the second arrow? Yes, Venerable Sir. The Buddha taught that when we experience pain, the first arrow, we often create additional suffering by our resistance to that pain, the second arrow. The first is unavoidable, the second is optional. Good. Now tell me, in your experience with anger, which is the first arrow and which is the second arrow? Ananda considered this question carefully. The first arrow would be the initial arising of irritation when something doesn't match my preferences. The second arrow would be my judgment about having that irritation, my shame about being angry, my fear that it makes me a bad monk, my attempts to suppress it. Exactly. You are creating far more suffering for yourself through your resistance to anger than the anger itself is creating. You are fighting a war against a natural human emotion, and like all wars, it is causing more damage than the original problem it was meant to solve. But surely anger is something I should overcome. Isn't the goal of Buddhist practice to eliminate negative emotions? The abbot smiled gently. That is a common misunderstanding, one that causes great suffering to sincere practitioners. The goal is not to eliminate natural human emotions, but to change our relationship to them. Anger will arise. This is part of being human. The question is, what do we do when it arises? I don't understand the difference. Come with me, the abbot said, rising from his cushion. I want to show you something. He led Ananda out of his quarters and along the path that wound through the monastery gardens toward the place where the three rivers converged. It was a beautiful spot, marked by large stones that provided natural seating, surrounded by willow trees whose branches hung down to touch the water's surface. Sit here, the abbot said, settling onto one of the stones and patting another beside him. Watch the water for a few moments. Ananda sat and turned his attention to the flowing water. Where the three rivers met, there was turbulence as the different currents encountered each other, swirls and eddies as the waters mixed and found their common direction. But farther downstream, the merged river flowed smoothly and peacefully, all the individual streams now part of a single, more powerful flow. What do you see? The abbot asked. I see the place where the rivers join. There's some turbulence where they meet, but then they settle into a unified flow. Yes. Now, would it make sense for us to try to prevent the rivers from meeting? To build barriers so that each stream stayed separate and there was never any turbulence where they converged? No, that would be impossible and pointless. The turbulence is natural and temporary. It's just what happens when different forces come together. This is exactly like the anger that arises in your mind. Different currents of experience, your preferences, the reality of what's happening. your ideas about how things should be. These meet and create turbulence. This turbulence is natural and temporary. It's just what happens when different forces in consciousness come together. Ananda stared at the water, beginning to understand something that had eluded him, despite years of study. You're saying that trying to prevent anger from arising is like trying to prevent the rivers from meeting? Yes, it's fighting against the natural flow of experience rather than learning to work with it. The question is not how to prevent anger, but how to let it flow through you without getting caught in it. How to experience it without being controlled by it. How do I do that? The same way the rivers do it. You don't resist the turbulence, but you also don't get swept away by it. You notice it arising, acknowledge its presence, and allow it to flow through you and return to peace, just as these waters flow from turbulence back to smoothness. As they sat by the converging rivers, the abbot shared a practice that was both simple and profound. When anger arose, instead of fighting it or hiding from it, Ananda could simply acknowledge its presence. Anger is here. Then, instead of judging himself for experiencing this natural human emotion, he could observe it with curiosity. What does anger feel like in my body? How does it affect my breathing? What thoughts accompany it? Treat anger like a visitor, the abbot explained. You don't have to invite it in, but you don't have to fight it at the door either. You can acknowledge its presence, observe it respectfully, and wait for it to complete its visit and depart naturally. What if other people notice that I sometimes feel angry? What if they lose respect for me as a teacher? Ah, said the abbot, now we arrive at the deepest teaching. You have been hiding your anger not because it was harming others, but because you were afraid it would damage your spiritual reputation. You have been more concerned with appearing enlightened than with actually developing enlightenment. The words struck Ananda like a bell, reverberating through his consciousness with the clarity of absolute truth. He had indeed been more focused on maintaining his image as a wise and peaceful monk than on actually cultivating wisdom and peace. His spiritual practice had become a performance rather than a genuine path of development. What would happen, the abbot continued, if you were honest with your fellow monks about your struggles? If you acknowledged that you, like all human beings, sometimes experience difficult emotions and are learning to work with them skillfully? I suppose they might lose respect for me. They might stop coming to me with questions. They might not consider me a good teacher anymore. They might find you more approachable, more human, more genuinely helpful as a teacher. Someone who has never struggled with anger cannot really guide others who are struggling with anger. Someone who pretends to have transcended all human challenges cannot offer practical help to those who are working with their own challenges. You mean, my anger might actually make me a better teacher if I approached it honestly? Not the anger itself, but your honest relationship to the anger, your willingness to acknowledge struggle, to work with difficulty, rather than pretending it doesn't exist, and to share the practical wisdom that comes from genuine spiritual effort rather than the theoretical wisdom that comes only from books. As winter deepened and the rivers froze at their edges while continuing to flow in their centers, Ananda began to practice the approach the abbot had taught him. When irritation arose during community activities, instead of suppressing it or fleeing from it, he would simply note its presence and observe its characteristics. When he felt judgment toward other monks or visiting lay people, instead of fighting these thoughts or hiding from the situations that triggered them, he would acknowledge them with curiosity rather than shame. The results were surprising and immediate. When he stopped fighting his anger, it began to flow through him more quickly, like water that is allowed to move freely rather than being dammed up. When he stopped judging his judgment, he had mental energy available to actually work with the situations that triggered his irritation instead of just reacting to them emotionally. More surprisingly, when he began to acknowledge his struggles honestly in conversations with fellow monks, he discovered that he was not alone in experiencing difficult emotions. Many of his brothers shared similar challenges with anger, with judgment, with the gap between their spiritual aspirations and their daily experience. His honesty about his own practice gave others permission to be honest about theirs, creating deeper and more authentic spiritual friendships. One evening, as Ananda was walking through the monastery gardens in the last light of day, he encountered Brother Pemba, a young monk who had recently joined the community and who often seemed troubled by something he was reluctant to discuss. "Brother Ananda," Pemba said, approaching with the hesitant manner of someone who needed advice but wasn't sure how to ask for it. "May I speak with you about something personal?" "Of course," Ananda replied, settling onto a bench beside the path. "What troubles you?" "I've been struggling with my meditation practice. No matter how hard I try, I can't seem to achieve the kind of peaceful states that the texts describe. My mind is always busy with thoughts, judgments, reactions to everything around me. I see other monks who seem so serene and focused, and I wonder if I'm just not cut out for this path." 6 months earlier, Ananda would have responded to this question with theoretical explanations about meditation technique and inspirational quotes from Buddhist scriptures. He would have presented himself as someone who had successfully navigated these challenges and could offer guidance from a position of achieved mastery. But now, having learned the difference between authentic teaching and spiritual performance, he responded from his actual experience rather than his desired image. "I understand this struggle very well," he said, "because I experience it regularly myself. Even after many years of practice, my mind still fills with judgments and reactions, especially when our routine is disrupted or when I encounter behavior that irritates me." Pemba looked up with surprise and relief. "Really? Even after all your years of study and practice?" "Yes. I used to think this meant I was failing at Buddhist practice. I would hide these experiences because I was afraid others would lose respect for me as a teacher. But I've learned that this struggle is actually part of the practice, not a sign that the practice isn't working." "What do you mean?" "Buddhism doesn't promise that we'll stop experiencing difficult emotions. It promises that we can learn to experience them without being controlled by them, to see them clearly without being overwhelmed by them. The goal is not to eliminate anger or judgment, but to change our relationship to anger and judgment." Ananda went on to share with Pemba the practice the abbot had taught him, acknowledging difficult emotions as they arose, observing them with curiosity rather than resistance, allowing them to flow through awareness without either suppressing them or being swept away by them. He spoke from his own ongoing experience rather than from textbook knowledge, offering practical guidance based on actual trial and error rather than theoretical understanding. "But what about the other monks who seem so peaceful all the time?" Pemba asked. "What about those who never seem to struggle with these kinds of problems?" Ananda smiled, remembering his own years of believing that everyone else had achieved spiritual states that remained mysteriously beyond his reach. "I used to think the same thing. But when I began to be honest about my own struggles, I discovered that most of them were experiencing similar challenges. Some are just better at hiding it, or further along in learning to work with it skillfully. So I'm not uniquely bad at this? Not at all. You're normally human, working with the normally difficult task of training your mind and heart. The Buddha himself described this work as challenging. If it were easy, he wouldn't have spent 45 years teaching different approaches and techniques for handling the obstacles that arise. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, listening to the sound of water flowing beneath the ice, Ananda realized that this conversation was the most satisfying teaching exchange he had experienced in years. By speaking from authentic experience rather than assumed authority, by acknowledging his ongoing challenges rather than pretending he had transcended them, he had created space for genuine spiritual friendship and mutual support. Over the following months, as word spread that Brother Ananda was approachable about practical spiritual difficulties rather than only theoretical questions, more monks began seeking his guidance. But the conversations were different now, less like a wise teacher dispensing knowledge to struggling students and more like fellow travelers sharing discoveries about the path they were walking together. Ananda found that his own practice deepened through these honest exchanges. When he could acknowledge his anger without shame, he could work with it more skillfully. When he could admit his limitations without fear, he could focus his energy on actual development rather than image management. When he could be genuinely helpful to others based on shared struggle rather than presumed superiority, he experienced the joy and connection that had originally drawn him to monastic life. The abbot, observing these changes from his position of quiet oversight, eventually called Ananda for another conversation. "I see that your practice has shifted in recent months," the abbot observed. "You seem more present in community activities, more available to your fellow monks, more genuinely peaceful despite continuing to experience the same challenges that troubled you before." "I think I've learned to stop fighting myself," Ananda replied. "When I was trying to be a perfect monk, I was constantly at war with my own human nature. Now I'm trying to be an honest monk, working skillfully with my human nature rather than pretending it doesn't exist." "And how has this affected your experience of anger?" Ananda considered the question thoughtfully. "The anger still arises sometimes, but it doesn't stay as long or burn as intensely. When I acknowledge it openly instead of hiding from it, it seems to lose much of its power over me. And when I don't have to maintain a pretense of never being angry, I have more energy available for cultivating actual patience and compassion. This is the paradox of spiritual development," the abbot said with a knowing smile. "When we try to force ourselves to be better than we are, we often become worse than we naturally would be. When we accept ourselves as we are and work gently with what's actually present, we create space for genuine transformation." I spent so many years believing that admitting spiritual struggles would undermine my ability to help others. But I've discovered the opposite. Acknowledging my struggles has made me more helpful, not less. Yes, a teacher who has never been lost cannot guide others who are lost. A monk who has never struggled with anger cannot help others work with anger. Perfection is not relatable. Authentic effort toward betterment is deeply relatable. So, the anger that I was so ashamed of was actually useful? Not useful in itself, but useful as a teacher. It showed you the places where your practice needed attention. It revealed the difference between spiritual pretense and spiritual authenticity. It gave you genuine understanding of the challenges that others face, which makes you a more effective guide. That spring, as the ice melted from the rivers and the monastery gardens began to show the first signs of new growth, Ananda was asked to lead a retreat for lay people who wanted to deepen their meditation practice. A year earlier, he would have approached such an assignment with terror, afraid that his spiritual inadequacies would be exposed to a group of sincere seekers. But now, he approached the retreat with calm confidence, based not on pretended perfection, but on honest experience. When participants shared their struggles with difficult emotions during meditation, he could offer practical guidance based on his own ongoing work with these challenges. When people expressed frustration about the gap between their spiritual ideals and their daily reality, he could acknowledge the universality of this difficulty, rather than pretending it was a problem only beginners faced. The path of awakening, he told the retreat participants during one of their evening discussions, is not about becoming someone different from who you are. It's about becoming more honest about who you are, more skillful in working with who you are, more compassionate toward who you are. We suffer not because we have human limitations, but because we resist having human limitations. One of the participants, a middle-aged woman who ran a small business in the valley, raised her hand with a question. But doesn't Buddhism teach that we should overcome our negative emotions? Doesn't anger prevent enlightenment? Buddhism teaches that we should understand our emotions, not that we should eliminate them, Ananda replied, drawing on the wisdom he had gained through direct experience rather than textbook study. Anger becomes a problem when we're controlled by it, or when we pretend it doesn't exist. But when we can observe anger clearly, acknowledge its presence honestly, and neither suppress it nor act from it unconsciously, it becomes just another aspect of our human experience that we can work with skillfully. So you still experience anger sometimes, even as a monk? Yes, Ananda said simply, and he felt the freedom that comes from speaking complete truth. I sometimes experience anger, sometimes judgment, sometimes frustration when things don't go according to my preferences. The difference is that now I recognize these emotions as visitors rather than as masters. I can feel angry without becoming an angry person. I can experience judgment without being controlled by judgment. How do you do that? Practice, Ananda replied with a smile. Lots and lots of honest practice, with the understanding that the practice itself is not about achieving some final state of perfection, but about learning to work more and more skillfully with whatever arises. Take a deep breath now. Let it flow out slowly, carrying with it any tension you've been holding, any effort you've been making. There is nothing you need to fix, nothing you need to perfect, nothing you need to become other than what you already are. Feel how your body naturally releases into rest when you stop trying to be different from what you are. This is the peace that comes from self-acceptance, from the end of war with your own nature. This story shows us that our spiritual struggles often come not from having human limitations, but from resisting having human limitations. Ananda discovered that his shame about experiencing anger was creating more suffering than the anger itself. Buddhism teaches that acceptance of our current experience rather than resistance to it creates the space where genuine transformation can occur. When we can be honest about our challenges instead of hiding them, we often find that the very honesty becomes the path to working with those challenges more skillfully. We have traveled far together tonight, exploring the many ways we create suffering through our judgments about ourselves and our fear of others' judgments about us. We met Jivan, whose beautiful blue hands he saw as shameful marks until he learned to see them as evidence of mastery and service. We encountered Tarun, whose small dishonesty grew into large complications, teaching us how fear-based choices often create the very problems they were meant to solve. We discovered Keiko, who tortured herself with imaginary criticisms from customers who were actually appreciating her efforts, learning that our minds often create the very judgments we fear. And we walked with Hiroshi, whose desperate attempt to maintain a perfect reputation led him to make promises he couldn't keep, until he learned that integrity matters more than image. Finally, we sat with Ananda by the flowing rivers, watching him discover that his spiritual struggles were not obstacles to authentic teaching, but the very foundation of it. That accepting our human limitations creates space for genuine growth, rather than preventing it. All of these teachings point to the same profound truth. We suffer not from what we are, but from what we think we are. We suffer not from others' judgments, but from our resistance to the possibility of being judged. We suffer not from our limitations, but from our refusal to accept that having limitations is part of being human. In your own life, you may find echoes of these stories. Perhaps you have experienced the shame of feeling marked or different, like Jivan with his blue hands. Perhaps you have made promises from fear rather than wisdom, like Taran with his borrowed plow. Perhaps you have imagined criticism where none existed, like Keiko in her tea shop. Perhaps you have tried to maintain an image of perfection that exhausted your energy and compromised your authentic work, like Hiroshi in his workshop. Perhaps you have hidden your struggles because you believed they disqualified you from helping others, like Ananda in his monastery. If you recognize yourself in any of these stories, know that you are not alone in these patterns. They are part of the human experience, woven into the very fabric of how consciousness works when it becomes entangled with self-image and fear. The Buddha saw these patterns clearly 2,500 years ago and offered teachings specifically designed to help us recognize and work with them. The deepest truth we have explored tonight is this: the judgment you fear most from others pales in comparison to the judgment you inflict upon yourself. The criticism that wounds you most deeply is not the criticism that comes from outside, but the criticism that you generate inside your own mind. And the freedom you seek is not freedom from others' opinions, but freedom from your own obsessive concern with others' opinions. Let your breathing slow now, becoming softer with each exhale. Feel your shoulders dropping, your jaw releasing, your whole body settling into the support beneath you. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to understand, nothing you need to fix or change or improve about yourself. You are exactly as you should be in this moment. Not perfect, not without challenges, not free from the human experiences of uncertainty and struggle, but exactly as you should be. Your limitations are not flaws in your design, but features of your humanity. Your struggles are not evidence of failure, but opportunities for growth. Your imperfections are not barriers to acceptance, but invitations to compassion. Let your eyes grow heavy if they aren't already closed. Let your breathing become so soft that you barely notice it. Let your body sink deeper into rest, knowing that you are held, you are safe, you are exactly where you need to be. In the mountains of Tibet, there is a practice among certain Buddhist monks of creating intricate sand paintings called mandalas. These works of art take days or sometimes weeks to complete, requiring hundreds of hours of meticulous attention as colored sand is carefully placed grain by grain to form complex geometric patterns of extraordinary beauty. The monks who create these mandalas are master artists, trained for years in the precise techniques required to handle the delicate materials and execute the intricate designs. Each mandala represents not only artistic skill, but also deep spiritual symbolism, with every color and pattern carrying meaning related to Buddhist philosophy and practice. But here is what makes this practice most remarkable. When the mandala is complete, when hundreds of hours of careful work have created something of breathtaking beauty, the monks deliberately destroy it. they sweep the sand away, returning the carefully placed grains to formlessness, transforming the masterpiece back into raw material. This destruction is not careless or disrespectful. It is done with the same ceremonial attention that was given to the creation. The sand is collected mindfully and often carried to a nearby river or stream, where it is released into the flowing water as an offering and a symbol of impermanence. Why do they do this? Why create something beautiful only to destroy it? The practice teaches us that attachment to our creations, no matter how beautiful or meaningful, becomes a source of suffering. The monks learn to pour their full attention and skill into their work without clinging to the results. They experience the joy of creation without the anxiety of preservation. They discover the freedom that comes from engaging completely with process rather than outcome. This teaching applies to more than artistic creation. It applies to the images we create of ourselves, the reputations we build, the identities we construct. Like sand mandalas, these are temporary formations that we often mistake for permanent reality. We suffer when we cling to them, when we try to preserve them against the natural changes that life brings. Jivan's attachment to being seen as normal rather than marked caused him to hide the very evidence of his mastery. Tarun's attachment to being seen as capable led him to make promises he couldn't keep. Keiko's attachment to living up to her grandmother's reputation prevented her from developing her own authentic style. Hiroshi's attachment to appearing perfect created chaos in his actual work. Ananda's attachment to being seen as spiritually advanced prevented him from engaging authentically with his practice. In each case, the suffering came not from their actual circumstances, but from their attachment to particular images of themselves, their resistance to being seen as anything other than what they thought they should be. Buddhism teaches us a different way of living, with full engagement, but without attachment, with complete effort, but without clinging to results, with deep care, but without desperate need for particular outcomes. Like the monks creating their sand mandalas, we can pour ourselves completely into our work, our relationships, our spiritual practice, while holding everything lightly enough that we can let it go when the time comes. This doesn't mean we become careless or indifferent. The monks who create mandalas are not casual about their work. Every grain of sand is placed with precision and attention, but they are free from the suffering that comes from grasping, from the anxiety of trying to make permanent what is naturally impermanent. In your own life, you can practice this same freedom. You can care deeply about your work without needing everyone to see you as the perfect worker. You can love your family without needing to be seen as the perfect parent or child or partner. You can engage in spiritual practice without needing to be seen as the perfect practitioner. Rest now in this understanding. Feel how much lighter you become when you release the burden of maintaining a perfect image. Feel how much more energy becomes available when you stop using it to defend against imaginary judgments. There was once a young potter named Yuki who lived in a village famous for its ceramics, where the local clay had qualities that made it particularly suitable for creating vessels that were both beautiful and durable. She had learned her craft from her father, who was respected throughout the region for his skill, and she had natural talent that promised a successful career following in his footsteps. But Yuki had developed a habit that was undermining both her skill and her peace of mind. Every pot she made had to be perfect, not just well-made or functional or pleasant to look at, but absolutely perfect, without the slightest asymmetry, without the faintest crack, without any variation from her ideal vision of what the piece should be. When Yuki was working at her potter's wheel, She would start and restart the same piece dozens of times. If the clay rose even slightly unevenly as she shaped it, she would collapse the form and begin again. If the rim wasn't perfectly round, if the walls varied in thickness by even a tiny amount, if the proportions didn't match exactly what she had envisioned, she would destroy her work and start over. This obsession with perfection meant that Yuki completed very few pieces. While other potters her age were producing vessels regularly and building their skills through practice, she was endlessly beginning and never finishing. Her father watched with growing concern as his talented daughter trapped herself in cycles of creation and destruction that led nowhere. "Yuki," he said one day as she crushed yet another nearly completed bowl because she had noticed a slight irregularity in its shape, "you have great skill, but you are using it to create suffering for yourself rather than beauty for others." "I want my work to be excellent," she replied, already beginning to center clay on the wheel for another attempt. "I don't want to make inferior pieces." "But what you are making now is nothing at all. A pot that is 80% of what you envisioned but actually exists is more valuable than a pot that would be 100% perfect but remains only in your imagination." Yuki understood her father's point intellectually, but emotionally she couldn't accept creating anything that fell short of her ideal. The thought of someone seeing her work and noticing its imperfections was unbearable to her. Better to make nothing than to make something flawed. One morning, as she was preparing clay for another day of futile attempts at perfection, an old woman came to their pottery workshop. She was clearly a traveler, with worn clothes and a walking staff, and she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen much of the world. "I am looking for a simple bowl," the woman said. "Nothing fancy or expensive, just something that will hold rice and soup, that will serve its purpose without breaking easily." Yuki's father was busy with a large commission, so he gestured for Yuki to help the customer. But Yuki felt panicked. She had no finished bowls to show, nothing that met her standards for public viewing. I don't have anything ready right now," she said uncomfortably. "Perhaps you could come back next week." The old woman looked around the workshop, noting the tools and materials that clearly indicated active pottery work, the wheel that was set up for use, the kiln that showed signs of regular firing. "You are a potter, but you have no pots?" she asked with gentle curiosity. Yuki felt her face flush with embarrassment. How could she explain her situation? That she was so obsessed with perfection that she destroyed everything she made? That she was so afraid of producing inferior work that she produced no work at all? "I'm very particular about quality," she said finally. "I don't like to sell pieces unless they meet high standards." The old woman nodded thoughtfully. "High standards are admirable, but may I ask, what happens to the pieces that don't meet these standards?" I destroy them and start over." "I see. So you create beauty and then destroy it because it is not beautiful enough?" The question hung in the air like smoke from green wood. Yuki had never thought about her process in these terms, but the woman's description was accurate. She was indeed creating beauty and then destroying it because it wasn't beautiful enough to satisfy her perfectionist demands. "Show me," the old woman said simply. "Show you what?" "Show me one of these imperfect bowls that you consider unworthy to exist." Yuki hesitated. She didn't have any completed bowls because she destroyed them before they could be fired, but she had clay prepared, and the woman's request seemed genuine rather than mocking. "I could make something quickly," she said, "but I want you to understand that it won't be my best work. I'll just throw something together to show you what I mean about imperfection." The old woman settled on a stool to watch as Yuki centered clay on her wheel and began to shape it. Freed from the pressure of creating a perfect piece, she worked with natural flow and ease, her hands remembering the joy of shaping clay that had first drawn her to pottery. The bowl that emerged was lovely in its simplicity, well-proportioned, smooth-walled, with a slight asymmetry that gave it character rather than detracting from its beauty. It was exactly the kind of functional, honest vessel that would serve a person well for many years. But as Yuki looked at it with her critical eye, she immediately saw its flaws. One side was perhaps a millimeter thicker than the other. The rim wasn't perfectly round. The proportions, while pleasant, didn't match the ideal she had been striving for in her failed attempts. "This is what I mean," she said to the old woman. "It's adequate, but it's not excellent. See how uneven the rim is? See how the walls vary in thickness?" The old woman took the bowl in her hands and examined it carefully, turning it slowly to see it from all angles. She ran her fingers around the rim, tested the weight and balance, held it up to the light to check the translucency of the clay. "This is a beautiful bowl," she said finally. "It has grace and character. It would serve its purpose perfectly and bring pleasure to whoever used it. I would be honored to own such a piece." Yuki blinked in surprise. "But the imperfections." "What imperfections?" "I see a bowl made by human hands, with the slight variations that show it was created by a living person rather than a machine. These variations don't detract from its beauty. They are part of its beauty." "You would actually want to buy this?" "Very much. In fact, I prefer this bowl to the perfectly symmetrical pieces I could buy from mass producers. This bowl has soul." For the first time in months, Yuki looked at her own work without seeing only its failings. She tried to see it through the old woman's eyes, not as a failed attempt at perfection, but as a successful creation of something beautiful and useful. "In Japan," the old woman continued, still holding the bowl admiringly, "there is a practice called wabi-sabi that finds beauty specifically in imperfection, in the natural variations that come from handwork and the passage of time. Masters of this aesthetic deliberately introduce asymmetries and irregularities because they understand that perfect symmetry can be cold and lifeless." "I've never heard of that approach." "It comes from understanding that perfection and beauty are not the same thing. Perfection is a mental concept, an abstract ideal that exists only in imagination. Beauty is something we experience directly, something that touches our hearts and enriches our lives. Often, the things that touch us most deeply are precisely those that show signs of their humanity, their handmade quality, their imperfect but genuine nature." The old woman purchased the bowl for the price Yuki's father would have charged for a standard piece, praising its craftsmanship and expressing genuine gratitude for its beauty. After she left, Yuki sat alone with her potter's wheel, contemplating what had just happened. She had created something that brought joy to another person, something that would serve a useful purpose for years to come, something that contained beauty, even though it didn't match her impossible standards for perfection. And she had done it quickly and naturally, without the agony of endless revision and self-criticism that had characterized her recent work. That afternoon, Yuki made 3 more bowls. Each one had slight imperfections by her previous standards, small asymmetries, minor variations in thickness, proportions that were pleasing but not mathematically precise. But each one was also complete, functional, and beautiful in its own way. When her father saw the finished pieces, he smiled with relief and pride. "Now you are potting again instead of just wrestling with clay. These bowls have life in them." "They're not perfect," Yuki said, though with less distress than she would have felt a week earlier. "No, they're not perfect. They're better than perfect. They're real, perfect bowls exist only in imagination. Real bowls exist in the world, where they can hold food and bring pleasure to people who use them. Over the following weeks, Yuki gradually learned to work with what the Japanese call wabi-sabi, the aesthetic of imperfection, of finding beauty in the natural variations that come from handwork and the honest acknowledgement of limitations. She discovered that when she stopped trying to eliminate all flaws, she could focus on bringing out the natural beauty of the clay and the grace of her own skilled hands. Her pottery improved dramatically as she completed more pieces and learned from actual experience rather than theoretical ideals. Each bowl taught her something about clay and form and balance that she could apply to the next piece. Her skills developed through practice rather than perfectionist paralysis. Most importantly, she began to enjoy her work again. The potter's wheel became a place of meditation and flow rather than struggle and frustration. She could lose herself in the pleasure of shaping clay, responding to what the material offered rather than forcing it to conform to rigid mental pictures. This story shows us how the pursuit of perfection often prevents us from creating anything at all. Yuki discovered that her fear of imperfection was destroying not only her pottery, but her joy in making pottery. Buddhism teaches that attachment to perfect outcomes prevents us from engaging fully with present process. When we can accept that our efforts will always have limitations, we create space to offer our genuine best rather than holding back until we can offer something impossible. Let us pause here in the quiet of this understanding. Your breath continues its perfect rhythm without any effort from you. Your heart beats its reliable rhythm without any instruction from you. Your body maintains its complex functions without any conscious control from you. Notice how nature achieves its purposes not through perfection, but through responsiveness, adaptation, and flow. The river doesn't worry about taking the perfect path to the sea. It simply flows around obstacles and finds its way naturally. The tree doesn't struggle to grow perfect branches. It responds to light and wind and soil, creating beauty through honest growth. You too can find this natural way of being, this flow that accomplishes much while striving little, this effectiveness that comes from working with reality rather than against it. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us at Sleepy Monk. Feel the clay of your own being, soft and responsive in the hands of this moment. You do not need to become a perfect vessel. You only need to allow yourself to be shaped by life with trust and openness, knowing that whatever form emerges will have its own unique beauty. There is an old teaching that says we are not human beings having a spiritual experience, but spiritual beings having a human experience. Tonight, you have remembered this truth. Your struggles, your imperfections, your moments of anger or judgment or fear. These are not obstacles to your spiritual nature, but expressions of it. Waves on the ocean of consciousness that you are. Let your body settle completely now, feeling heavier with each breath, sinking deeper into rest. Your mind can release its grip on all the stories it tells about who you should be, what others think of you, how you measure against impossible standards. You are enough. You have always been enough. You will always be enough. In the deepest part of your being, where no judgment can reach, where no criticism can penetrate, where no comparison can disturb, there is perfect peace. This peace is not something you must create or achieve or earn. It is what you are beneath all the layers of worry and performance and self-doubt. Rest in this peace now. Let it hold you as gently as a mother holds her sleeping child. Let it surround you like warm water, like soft light. like the embrace of unconditional love. You are home.